I've been a park ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains for 11 years. I started in 2013 as a seasonal interpretive ranger at a visitor center near Asheville, the kind of entry-level position where you spend your days answering questions about waterfalls, bear safety, and where to get the best photograph of the sunset. I moved into backcountry patrol in my second year, which is where I found my purpose in my career, working the trails and the remote sections of the forest that most visitors never see, the places where the managed landscape of the national park gives way to the actual mountain, the old growth and the rhododendron hills and the hollows that haven't changed since the Cherokee walked them and won't change after the last ranger hangs up his radio. I know these trails, not the way a hiker knows them, from a guidebook and a weekend of walking. I know them the way a plumber knows the pipes in a building he's maintained for a decade. Every junction, every weak point, every place where the system behaves differently than the blueprint says it should. I know the maintained trails, and the unmarked spurs, and the game paths that deer and bear and turkey have worn into the forest floor over generations. I know which creek crossings flood in spring, and which ridgeline sections collect ice in November, and where the rhododendron thickets grow so dense that a person who steps off the trail will be disoriented within 20 feet. The forest is my workplace. I walk it the way an office worker walks a corridor, with the automatic, unconscious familiarity that comes from repetition so thorough that the body navigates while the mind thinks about other things. I'm telling you this because what happened in my third year doesn't make sense unless you understand that I don't get lost, and I don't see things that aren't there, and I don't mistake game paths for trails or natural clearings for constructed sites. I am trained in observation. I am paid to notice what's different about the forest on any given day compared to what was there the day before. And what I found near Crabtree Falls in the fall of 2015 was different in a way that 11 years of subsequent experience have not been able to explain. The patrol was routine. I was doing a condition assessment on a section of trail that runs along the upper drainage above Crabtree Falls, a moderate route through mixed hardwood and hemlock that follows the contour of the ridge before descending through a series of switchbacks to the fall's overlook. The trail is well maintained and heavily trafficked in summer, but quiets down significantly in October, when the leaf peepers have gone home and the weather turns unpredictable, and the forest begins the slow, dramatic process of shutting down for winter. I was checking drainage structures and trail surfaces for erosion damage after a heavy rain the previous week. Working my way along the ridgeline section, where the trail runs through a stretch of old rhododendron that forms a tunnel over the path. The rhododendron thicket on the south side of the trail was dense, the kind of impenetrable vegetative wall that the mountains produce when the conditions are right, the glossy dark leaves interlocking to form a barrier that's as effective as any fence. Rhododendron thickets are one of the defining features of the southern Appalachians, and they're also one of the most disorienting. The canopy blocks the sky. The trunks twist and branch at shoulder height. The leaf litter beneath is sparse because the rhododendron shade kills the understory. Walking into a thicket without a trail is an exercise in confusion that ends, often, with a search and rescue call. I was checking a drainage dip about halfway along the ridgeline section when I saw it. A trail. Entering the rhododendron thicket from the main trail at an angle of about 30 degrees, descending into the thicket and disappearing into the green dark interior. It was not a game path. Game paths are narrow, usually less than a foot wide, and they meander, following the contours of the terrain, the way animals follow the path of least resistance. This was a human trail, 2 feet wide, packed dirt, well-worn, the surface compressed by traffic that had been consistent enough and prolonged enough to kill the vegetation and compact the soil into the smooth, firm surface that trails develop when hundreds of feet walk them over years. The edges were clean, the boundary between trail and thicket sharp and well-defined, without the gradual transition of encroaching vegetation that you see on trails that are lightly used or recently established. I stopped. I pulled out my map. The section of the ridgeline I was standing on was fully documented. Every trail, every spur, every connector was marked. The rhododendron thicket on the south side of the main trail was shown as unbroken forest, no trails, no structures, no features of any kind. The topographic contours indicated a hollow below the ridge, a drainage that fed into the creek system above the falls, but there was no marked trail leading into it. I checked my GPS. Same result. The trail I was looking at, the well-worn, clearly established path entering the rhododendron thicket, did not exist on any map or in any database that the Park Service maintained. I should have radioed it in and waited for another ranger. That's the protocol for encountering unauthorized trail construction or social trails that have developed through repeated use. Document, report, wait for guidance. But the trail didn't look unauthorized. It didn't look social. It looked old, established, maintained. It looked like it had been there for a very long time, and I had simply never noticed it, which was possible in the same way that it's possible to overlook a door in a building you've walked through 1,000 times. Possible, but deeply unlikely. I followed it into the thicket. The rhododendron closed behind me almost immediately, the branches filling the space I'd come through, as if the vegetation had been held aside for my entry and released when I passed. Within 20 feet, the main trail was invisible behind me. Within 50 feet of the sounds of the ridge, the wind, the birds, and the ambient noise of the forest at elevation had been replaced by the particular acoustic deadness of the rhododendron interior, where the dense foliage absorbs sound the way carpet absorbs footsteps. The trail descended steadily, curving through the thicket with a smooth, gradual arc that suggested it had been laid out by someone who understood how people walk on slopes and designed the path to accommodate the body's preference for long, gentle curves over sharp switchbacks. About a quarter mile in, the feeling started. I don't have a precise word for it. Dread is too strong. Unease is too weak. It was the feeling of being observed by something that was aware of me in a way that exceeded simple attention. Not watched the way a deer watches a hiker, with alert, reactive awareness. Watch the way a camera watches, with a passive, recording attention that doesn't react but doesn't stop. The forest around the trail was silent, not quiet, silent. No bird song, no insect sound, no wind in the canopy above the rhododendron. If there was a canopy, I couldn't see through the dense overhead cover. The only sound was my boots on the packed dirt of the trail, my breathing, and the occasional creak of my pack. I noticed the trail surface. It was clean, not just maintained, but also clean. No deadfall across it. In a rhododendron thicket, branches fall constantly. The brittle, dead limbs of the interior trees dropping onto whatever surface is beneath them. A trail through a thicket should have debris on it within days of being cleared. This trail had none. No sticks, no leaves, no fragments of bark. The surface was bare dirt, packed and smooth, as if it had been swept, and there were no spider webs across the path. In the southern Appalachians in October, spiders build webs across every gap and opening in the forest. Walking any trail in the morning means breaking webs with your face and hands every few feet. This trail had no webs. Not a single strand across the path, which meant either someone had walked it very recently, within the last hour, or nothing living crossed from one side to the other. No insect, no spider, no animal, nothing. The thicket opened, not gradually, the way the edge of a thicket normally transitions to open forest. Abruptly. The rhododendron ended, and I was standing at the edge of a clearing, a circle of bare ground, maybe 20 feet in diameter, surrounded by the wall of the thicket on all sides. The ground was dirt, not the forest floor with its layers of leaf litter and decomposition. Bare, exposed dirt, the color of rust, compacted and smooth, without a single blade of grass, or a single leaf, or a single twig. The circle was perfect, not approximately round, the way natural clearings are. Geometrically perfect, as if inscribed with a compass. The edge where the dirt met the base of the rhododendron was as sharp and as precise as a line cut with a blade. Nothing grew in the circle. The dirt showed no evidence of fire, no charcoal, no ash, no scorching, no evidence of chemical treatment, no bleaching, no salt patterns, no evidence of any human activity that would explain why a circle of ground in the middle of a rhododendron thicket would be completely, permanently bare. The soil looked sterile, not dead in the way that contaminated soil looks dead. Sterile in the way that a hospital floor is sterile, a surface from which life has been removed with a thoroughness that goes beyond natural processes. In the center of the circle was a cairn, 3 feet tall, maybe 2 feet wide at the base, built from flat stones, that had been selected for uniformity and stacked with a precision that I recognized from my training in historical site assessment as the work of skilled hands. The stones were local, the gray sandstone and mica-flecked gneiss that you find throughout the Blue Ridge, but they had been shaped, not cut with tools. Shaped by hand, the edges rounded and fitted with an interlocking technique that kept each stone seated against the ones beneath it without mortar. The cairn was not a recent construction. The stones were settled. The surfaces were weathered. Lichen grew on the north-facing sides of the lower courses, the pale green and orange crusts that develop over decades. This cairn had been here for a very long time. I stood at the edge of the circle, and I looked at the cairn, and the cairn looked back at me. I know that's not a rational statement. Stones don't look at anything. But the feeling I had, standing at the boundary between the trail and the circle, was the feeling of being regarded by something that occupied the center of that space, and had been occupying it for longer than I could guess. The observation I'd felt on the trail intensified here, concentrated, focused, as if whatever had been passively recording my approach was now actively examining me, evaluating me, deciding something about me that I was not equipped to understand. I radioed my position. The dispatcher, a woman named Linda who had worked the desk for 20 years and who knew the trail system as well as any ranger in the field, responded immediately. I gave her my GPS coordinates and described what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said there's no trail at those coordinates. I said I was standing on one. She said the GPS position I'd given her was in the middle of an unbroken rhododendron thicket on the south slope of the ridge above crabtree drainage. No trail, no clearing, no structure. I said I was looking at a cairn in a cleared circle at the end of a well-maintained trail. She said she'd log the report and suggested I photograph the site and return to the main trail. I photographed everything: the trail, the clearing, the circle of bare dirt, the cairn. I took wide-angle shots from the edge of the circle and close-ups of the cairn's construction and detail shots of the lichen on the stones. I took a photograph of the ground at the boundary between the dirt and the rhododendron, where the sharp edge of the circle met the base of the thicket. I took a photograph of the trail behind me, the clean, well-worn path disappearing into the rhododendron tunnel. I recorded the GPS coordinates on my handheld unit and in my notebook, and I marked the spot on my map with a pencil. Then I walked back out. The return trip felt longer than the approach. The trail was the same, clean and smooth and silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. On the way in, it had felt passive, the absence of sound in a space that absorbed it. On the way out, it felt active, a silence that was being maintained, the way a person maintains silence when they're listening. Something in the thicket was listening to me leave with the same attention it had paid to my arrival, and the attention didn't diminish as I walked but intensified, as if my departure was more interesting than my approach, as if the act of leaving was being noted with a significance that I couldn't fathom. I reached the main trail and stepped out of the thicket, and the sounds of the forest returned immediately. The wind and the birds and the distant murmur of the creek below the falls. The transition was instantaneous. One step, I was in silence. The next time I was in the normal acoustic environment of the Blue Ridge in October, I looked behind me. The entrance to the trail was visible in the rhododendron, the opening where the path descended into the thicket, clear and right where I'd entered. I hiked back to the station and filed my report and uploaded my photographs to the database and went home and slept badly and returned the next morning with another ranger, a man named Davis, who had been in the Park Service for 15 years and who I trusted to be thorough and skeptical in equal measure. We hiked to the ridgeline section where I'd found the trail. We stood at the exact GPS coordinates I'd marked. The rhododendron thicket was unbroken, no trail, no opening, no gap in the dense, interlocking branches that formed the wall of vegetation along the south side of the main trail. Davis looked at me, looked at the thicket, and looked at the GPS and said, "There's nothing here." I said, "I know." He said maybe it was further along. We walked the entire ridgeline section, both directions, checking every point where the rhododendron might have concealed an entrance. Nothing. The thicket was solid, impenetrable, the same wall of glossy dark leaves that it had always been, showing no sign that anything had passed through it recently or at any point in the past. I showed Davis the photographs on my phone. He looked at them for a long time. The trail, the clearing, the cairn, the bare dirt circle with its precise edge. He didn't say I was wrong. He didn't say I was lying. He looked at the photographs, and he looked at the thicket, and he said, I don't know what to do with this. And we hiked back to the station, and the report was filed, and nothing happened. No investigation, no follow-up, no explanation. The photographs are in the database. The GPS coordinates are in my notebook. The cairn exists in 12 high-resolution images on a server in the Park Service's regional office, and the trail that led me to it is gone. I've been back to that section of the ridgeline more times than I can count in the 11 years since. I've walked the main trail in every season and every weather condition. I've pushed into the rhododendron thicket at the GPS coordinates, fighting through branches that tore at my clothes and scratched my arms, covering maybe 50 feet before the density became impassable. There is no trail. There is no clearing. There is no cairn. The forest at those coordinates is what the map says it is. An unbroken rhododendron thicket on a south-facing slope, dense and dark and impassable, without a machete and a level of determination that exceeds any reasonable purpose. But the photographs are real. I look at them sometimes, late at night, when the rational architecture of my training feels less solid than it does during the day. The trail in the photographs is real. The dirt is real. The cairn is real. The lichen on the stones is real. I showed the photographs to a geologist at Appalachian State who studies the cultural landscapes of the Blue Ridge. She said the cairn construction was consistent with pre-colonial stoneworking techniques, the kind of deliberate, skilled masonry that predates European settlement. She estimated the lichen growth at a minimum of 150 years. She asked where the site was. I gave her the coordinates. She looked at the topographic map and said there's nothing there. I said I know. I don't know what I found. I don't know what the trail was or where it led or who built the cairn or why the ground in that circle is bare. I don't know why the trail existed on one day and not the next, or why a path that showed decades of foot traffic could be there in the afternoon and gone by the following morning without a trace. I don't know what was watching me from the thicket, or what the silence meant, or why the feeling of being observed intensified when I left, as if my departure was being recorded with more care than my arrival. But I know what I walked on. I know what I photographed. I know the lichen on those stones has been growing for 150 years, on a cairn that sits in a clearing that doesn't exist, at the end of a trail that isn't on any map, in a section of forest that my agency maintains and monitors and patrols, and that, on one afternoon in October of 2015, opened a door that had been closed for longer than anyone alive can remember, and let me walk through it and see what was on the other side. And then it closed, and the forest went back to being what the maps say it is. And the cairn went back to wherever cairns go when the trails that lead to them disappear. And I went back to my patrols and my reports and my rational, documented understanding of a forest that I thought I knew completely, and that showed me, in the space of a single afternoon, that knowing a place and understanding it are not the same thing, and that the forest keeps things that the maps don't show, and that sometimes, on days that have no special quality to distinguish them from any other, the forest shows you what it's keeping, and then it takes it back, and you're left with photographs of a place that was real and isn't anymore, and the knowledge that the mountain you walk every day contains rooms you've never seen, and doors you can't find, and a silence that listens when you walk through it and watches when you leave. The Linville Gorge Outpost is a 12 by 16 cabin on the west rim of the gorge, about 1.5 miles from the nearest trailhead and accessible only by a fire road that the Forest Service maintains with the minimum effort required to keep a truck from getting stuck. The cabin was built in the 60s as a fire monitoring station and converted to a backcountry ranger outpost in the 80s when the gorge was designated as a wilderness area, and the service decided it needed a permanent presence during the high-use seasons. It has a wood stove, a radio, a bunk with a mattress that's been replaced twice in my memory, and a front window that faces east across the gorge toward the ridgeline of Jonas Ridge and Hawksbill Mountain. During the day, the view from that window is one of the most spectacular in the southern Appalachians, the gorge opening below you like a wound in the earth, 1,000 feet deep, the Linville River visible as a silver thread at the bottom, The old-growth forest on the walls, so thick and so dark, it looks like the canyon is lined with fur. During the day, it's beautiful. At night, it's a void. The gorge becomes a black absence in the landscape, a place where the world drops away and the darkness begins, and the only evidence that the canyon exists is the sound of the river, faint and far below, and the particular quality of silence that rises from a space that large and that empty. I was assigned to the outpost for 2 consecutive seasons, the spring and fall of 2019 and 2020. The job was monitoring backcountry use, enforcing permit requirements, responding to emergencies, and serving as the service's eyes and ears in a section of wilderness that was too remote for regular patrol from the main station. I lived in the cabin for 6-week rotations, resupplied every 2 weeks by a truck that came up the fire road and left coolers of food and water and propane and whatever else I'd requested on the manifest. Between resupplies, I was alone. The radio connected me to the district station about 15 miles away, and a satellite phone in a locked box served as emergency backup. But for practical purposes, I was as isolated as a person can be while technically employed by a federal agency. The first 2 nights were unremarkable. I built fires in the wood stove and read and ate canned food heated on a camp stove, and listened to the radio chatter from the district station, and went to bed early because there's nothing else to do at an outpost when the sun goes down and the gorge turns black, and the only light for miles is the one you make yourself. I slept with my boots by the door and the radio on low, the way outpost rangers are trained to sleep, ready to respond to a call that could come at any hour. The forest around the cabin was quiet in the way that forests are quiet at night, which is to say not quiet at all. The constant layered sound of insects and frogs, and the wind in the canopy, and the occasional call of an owl, or the rustle of something moving through the leaf litter. Normal sounds. The sounds of a forest doing what forests do after dark. On the 3rd night, I woke up at 2 in the morning, not from the radio, not from a sound I consciously identified. I woke the way you wake when something has changed in the acoustic environment. The way you wake when a noise that's been constant stops, or a noise that wasn't there starts. I lay in the bunk, and I listened. The forest was quiet. Not the normal quiet of a forest at night, where the silence between sounds is filled with the ambient texture of life continuing in the dark. This was the other kind of quiet, the kind where everything has stopped. The insects were silent. The frogs were silent. The wind had died. The forest around the cabin had gone mute with the totality that means either the weather has changed drastically or something is present that has frightened every living thing within earshot into stillness. The scream came from the gorge. It started low, a bass tone that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears, a vibration that seemed to come up through the floor of the cabin and into the frame of the bunk and into my body. It climbed, not quickly, not the sudden escalation of a startled animal, steadily, deliberately, the pitch rising through a range that moved from the subaudible to the audible to a frequency so high that it stopped being a sound and became a sensation, a pressure in my jaw and my sinuses, and behind my eyes that made my teeth ache the way they ache when you bite into something frozen. The scream lasted maybe 8 seconds. It filled the gorge, not the way a sound fills a room, bouncing off walls and decaying. It filled the gorge the way water fills a vessel, rising from the bottom and spreading to the edges and saturating every cubic foot of air between the walls of the canyon. And then it stopped. Not faded, not diminished, stopped, cut off in the middle of its highest pitch with an abruptness that was more disturbing than the sound itself, as if whatever was producing it had been silenced by something faster and stronger than the scream. The silence after the scream was absolute. The forest didn't resume. The insects didn't start back up. The frogs didn't call. The wind didn't return. I lay in the bunk, and I listened to nothing for what felt like a very long time. And then, gradually, over the course of maybe 10 minutes, the forest came back. Sound by sound, a cricket first, then a tree frog, then the wind, tentatively, as if testing whether it was safe. The normal acoustic environment of the gorge rebuilt itself from the ground up, each sound returning individually, each one cautious. I got up. I went to the window and looked out at the gorge. Black. The void. The river is invisible 1,000 feet below. The opposite ridge, a slightly darker line against the dark sky. Nothing moved. Nothing was visible. The gorge was the same space it was every night, holding its darkness with the same patient indifference. I radioed the district station. The night dispatcher was a man named Terrence, who had been working the desk for over a decade and who responded to most calls with the unflappable monotone of a person who has heard everything and been surprised by nothing. I described the sound. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it was probably a mountain lion. Cougars produce a scream that sounds almost human, he said, especially at a distance, especially when the acoustics of a canyon amplify and distort the sound. I said this didn't sound like a mountain lion. He said there hadn't been a confirmed cougar sighting in the Linville Gorge section in over 12 years, but that didn't mean they weren't there. He said the gorge is wild country, and wild country produces sounds that don't always match what you expect. He logged the report and told me to get some sleep. The scream came again the next night. 2 in the morning. Same progression. The low tone rising through the audible spectrum to the tooth-aching high pitch, and then the abrupt termination. Same duration, same quality, same silence before and after. I was awake for it this time, having set an alarm for 1:45 out of a compulsion I couldn't resist. I stood at the window and I listened to the gorge scream, and I watched the darkness for any sign of what was producing the sound, and I saw nothing. The gorge was black and empty, and the scream filled it from wall to wall, and then it stopped, and the silence held, and the forest rebuilt itself one sound at a time. On the 5th night, I recorded it. I opened the voice memo app on my phone, set it on the windowsill, and waited. 2 in the morning. The forest went quiet. The scream started. I watched the recording indicator on my phone, the red bar pulsing, the timer counting, the file growing. The scream lasted its usual 8 seconds. The phone recorded for 30. I stopped the recording and played it back immediately, standing at the window with the phone to my ear. Silence. The file played for its full 30 seconds and produced no sound. Not a diminished version of the scream. Not a faint reproduction. Nothing. The file was empty. The waveform, when I looked at it on the screen, was a flat line, the visual representation of zero audio, as if the phone had been recording in a vacuum. I checked the microphone. I recorded my own voice. The playback was clear and normal. I recorded the sounds of the forest, the insects, and the frogs that had resumed after the scream. Clear and normal. The phone worked. The microphone worked. The recording function worked. But the scream, the sound that had filled a 1,000-foot canyon with enough volume to make my teeth ache from a mile away, had left no trace on the recording. I tried the next night again. Same result. And the next. And the next. I tried different recording apps. I tried a handheld digital recorder from the supply closet at the outpost. I tried the voice recording function on the satellite phone. Every device produced the same result, a file of the correct duration with no audio content. The scream existed in the air and in my ears and in the canyon, and refused to exist on any medium designed to capture it. It was a sound that could be heard but not kept. I heard it every night for the remaining 6 weeks of my rotation, 2 in the morning, without exception. I stopped trying to record it after the 2nd week, and I stopped radioing it in after the 3rd, because there was nothing new to report, and Terrence had exhausted his supply of reassuring explanations. I just listened. I lay in the bunk, or stood at the window, and I listened to the forest go silent, and the scream rise from the gorge, and fill the canyon, and stop. And I waited for the forest to come back, and then I went to sleep, or didn't, and the night continued, and the morning came, and the gorge was beautiful. Again, in the daylight, the spectacular view, the river, the old growth, the canyon walls painted in the greens and golds of whatever season I was in. Beautiful and normal and completely silent, in the way that a gorge is silent during the day, when the depth produces echoes rather than screams. I finished my rotation. Dee drove back to the district station, filed my reports, and said nothing about the scream to anyone except in the clinical, documented language of the incident logs. A ranger named Whitfield took the outpost for the next rotation. He was younger than me, a 2nd-year seasonal with the confidence of someone who had chosen this work because he loved the wilderness and hadn't yet learned. that loving the wilderness and understanding the wilderness are different things. Whitfield lasted 4 nights. He radioed the district station on the 5th morning and requested an immediate transfer. His voice on the radio was flat and controlled, in the way that voices are flat and controlled when the person speaking is managing something larger than the words can carry. He said he couldn't sleep at the outpost anymore. He didn't say why. The dispatcher asked him to specify the nature of his concern for the incident report. Whitfield was quiet for a long time. Then he said the gorge makes a sound at night. He said it like it was the most important thing he'd ever said, and also the least adequate. The gorge makes a sound at night. That's all he'd give them. He packed his gear, hiked to the trailhead, drove to the district station, submitted his transfer request, and was reassigned to a visitor center in Asheville, where the loudest sound at night was traffic. I saw him once, about a year later, at a training conference in Boone. We were in the same session, and during a break, I walked over and said, "I heard you had a tough rotation at Linville." He looked at me. He knew I'd been stationed there before him. He knew I'd heard it too. He didn't need me to say what it was. He just looked at me and said, "Did you ever figure out what it was?" I said no. He nodded. He said, "It doesn't record." I said, "I know." He said, "I tried everything." I said, "I know." He was quiet for a while. Then he said the thing that I haven't been able to stop thinking about in the years since. He said on his 4th night, the night before he requested the transfer, he'd been standing at the window during the scream, the way I used to stand, watching the darkness of the gorge while the sound filled it. And just before the scream cut off, in the instant before the abrupt silence that always ended it, he heard something else. Underneath the scream, behind it, a second sound that the scream had been covering, the way a loud noise covers a quiet one. A sound that was only audible in the fraction of a second between the scream stopping and the silence beginning. He said it was breathing. Deep, slow, enormous breathing, rising from the floor of the gorge, the respiration of something so large that each breath moved enough air to be heard from the rim 1,000 feet above. He said the scream wasn't the thing. The scream was what the thing produced, the way a whale produces a song or a cicada produces a buzz. The scream was a function, an output, and underneath it, in the gap between the sound and the silence, the thing that produced it was breathing. I didn't go back to the outpost after that conversation. The service staff is staffed with seasonal rangers who do their 6 weeks and leave, and either say nothing or say enough that the next ranger hears the rumors and goes anyway, because the wilderness is the reason they took the job, and the gorge is the wildest piece of it. And every season, without fail, someone hears the scream. And every season, without fail, the recordings come back empty. And the gorge keeps its sound, the way it keeps its darkness, holding it in the 1,000-foot depth of the canyon, where the river runs and the old growth grows, and something breathes in the space between the scream and the silence, patient and vast and unrecordable, producing its nightly sound for reasons that the forest knows and the rim doesn't, and the recorders can't capture, and the rangers can't explain. I've been doing search and rescue in the Blue Ridge for 9 years. In that time, I've responded to maybe 200 calls, everything from lost day hikers who wandered off a blazed trail to multi-day searches for backcountry backpackers who got caught in weather they weren't prepared for. Most of them end well. Somebody gets turned around, somebody twists an ankle, somebody underestimates the distance or the elevation or the speed at which the temperature drops when the sun goes behind the ridge. We find them, we walk them out, we file the report. The ones that don't end well are rare enough that each one stays with you, a mental file that doesn't close, a name and a face, and a set of circumstances that you revisit in the quiet moments between calls because the resolution was wrong or absent. And the human mind doesn't accept unresolved narratives without protest. The call came in on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2022. Missing hiker near Grandfather Mountain, a 62-year-old woman named Patricia Embry, who had registered at the Profile Trail trailhead for a solo day hike at 9 that morning. Her husband, who had dropped her off and planned to pick her up at 4, reported her overdue when she wasn't at the trailhead at 4:15. Standard procedure. The trail she'd registered on was a moderate out and back, about 7 miles round trip, well maintained and well blazed. popular with experienced day hikers, and not typically a source of significant SAR activity. Patricia Embry was, according to her husband, an experienced hiker who'd been walking these trails for 30 years and knew the mountain well. We assembled a team of 4 rangers and split into 2 pairs, one working the trail from the trailhead upward and the other accessing the trail from a secondary point about halfway up and working down. I was paired with a ranger named Holt, who'd been in the service about 3 years. A young guy, competent and calm. The kind of person you want on a search team because he doesn't project anxiety, and he follows procedure without being reminded. We took the lower section, starting at the trailhead and working up. The light was already starting to go when we set out. October in the Blue Ridge means sunset around 6:30, which gives you maybe an hour of useful twilight before the forest gets dark enough to require headlamps. We moved quickly, calling out at intervals, scanning both sides of the trail for any sign of a person who had stepped off the path or collapsed or sheltered in a place that wouldn't be immediately visible from the trail surface. The forest was in full autumn transition, the canopy thinning, the understory visible through gaps in the foliage that wouldn't have existed a month earlier. Good conditions for a visual search. About 2 hours in, roughly 3 miles from the trailhead, I found her. She was sitting on a flat rock about 10 feet off the trail on the uphill side, a woman who matched the description exactly. Gray hair, medium build, wearing a blue fleece jacket, khaki hiking pants, and the kind of trail runners that experienced day hikers wear, lightweight with aggressive tread. She had a small day pack beside her and a water bottle in her hand, and she was sitting with her right leg extended and her left knee bent, the posture of someone who is favoring an injury and has arranged themselves for comfort rather than movement. She looked up when I called out. Her expression was calm, not distressed, not frightened, not relieved in the way that found subjects are usually relieved. With the visible release of tension that comes from seeing a uniform and knowing that help has arrived. She was calm, the way a person is calm when they've been waiting for something they expected, and it has arrived on schedule. She said hello. She said her name was Patricia. She said she'd twisted her ankle about an hour ago and decided to sit and wait rather than risk making it worse on the descent. I checked her ankle. It was swollen but not severely, consistent with a minor sprain, the kind of injury that would make hiking uncomfortable but not impossible. She was coherent, hydrated, not hypothermic, not in any immediate medical distress. I radioed the search coordinator at the trailhead. I said I'd located the subject, gave our GPS position, and reported her condition as stable with a minor ankle injury. The coordinator confirmed and said he'd notify the husband. I told Patricia we'd take it slow on the way down, and she nodded and stood with the careful, weight-tested movements of a person who knows how to move on an injured leg without making it worse. We walked back together, Patricia and I in front, Holt behind, moving at a pace that accommodated her ankle and that allowed us to reach the trailhead before we lost the light entirely. She was pleasant company. She talked about the trail and the views and the particular quality of light that the Blue Ridge produces in October, the way the afternoon sun comes through the thinning canopy at an angle that turns the forest into something that looks like stained glass. She talked about her husband, about their retirement, about how they'd moved to the area from Virginia specifically because of the hiking. She was articulate and specific and entirely present, a real person with a real history and a real life that extended in both directions from this moment on the trail. We reached the trailhead at dusk. The parking lot had the usual SAR configuration. 2 ranger vehicles, the coordinator's truck, and Patricia's husband's SUV. The coordinator, a man named Barnes, who had been running searches in this district for 15 years, was standing at the edge of the lot. When he saw us coming down the trail, his expression changed. Not relief. Not the satisfaction of a successful outcome. Something else. Something that tightened the muscles around his eyes and compressed his mouth into a line that I recognized from years of working with him as the expression he wore when a situation had become complicated in a way that procedure didn't cover. He let me bring Patricia to her husband. She walked to the SUV, and her husband embraced her, and she sat on the tailgate and drank water from a bottle he handed her, and they talked quietly, and she was real. Every part of her was real. The swollen ankle, and the blue fleece, and the khaki pants, and the day pack, and the way she held the water bottle, and the sound of her voice describing her afternoon. Real in every physical, verifiable, measurable sense. Barnes pulled me aside. He walked me about 30 feet from the vehicles, out of earshot, and he stopped, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face in 15 years of SAR coordination. He said, "The subject has already been found." I didn't understand. I said, "I know. I just brought her in." He said, "No." He said the subject was found approximately 2 hours ago by Ranger Dawes, working the upper section of the trail. He said Dawes had located a woman matching the description of Patricia Embry at a point approximately 2 miles from my position, sitting on a rock beside the trail with a twisted right ankle. He said the woman had identified herself as Patricia Embry and had provided details consistent with the missing person report. He said Dawes had radioed his find at roughly the same time I had radioed mine. He said the woman Dawes found was currently at the ranger station, about a mile from the trailhead, being evaluated by the medical team. I looked at Barnes. I looked at Patricia, sitting on the tailgate of her husband's SUV, talking to him about her afternoon. I looked back at Barnes. I said, "That's not possible." He said, "I know. 2 Patricia Embrys, found at approximately the same time by 2 different rangers on 2 different sections of the same trail. Same name, same description, same clothing, same injury, a twisted right ankle, same story. Sat down to wait for help rather than risk making it worse. Same calm, coherent demeanor, same physical presence, real and solid and undeniably there. 2 women matching every detail of one missing person report, located simultaneously 2 miles apart on a mountain where only one Patricia Embry had registered to hike. I drove to the ranger station. It was about a 5-minute drive from the trailhead, a small building that served as the district headquarters with an office and a first aid room and a back entrance that opened onto a gravel lot. Dawes was inside. He was sitting at the desk in the front office with his hands flat on the surface and his face carrying an expression that I can only describe as evacuated. The look of a person who has processed something that their understanding of the world cannot accommodate and who has not yet found the container to hold it. I asked where she was. He said she'd been in the first aid room. He said he'd stepped into the office to start the incident report, which takes maybe 10 minutes, and when he went back to check on her, she was gone. The back door was open. The gravel lot was empty. She hadn't signed out. She hadn't taken anything. She'd simply walked out the back door and disappeared in the time it took him to fill out a form. I asked him to describe her. He described Patricia Embry, blue fleece, khaki pants, trail runners, gray hair, medium build, calm, coherent, twisted right ankle. He said she'd been pleasant. She'd talked about the trail and the views and the light in October. She'd mentioned her husband. She'd mentioned their retirement. She'd mentioned moving from Virginia. Every detail was identical to the woman I'd walked off the mountain. The woman who was currently sitting on the tailgate of her husband's SUV, drinking water and being real. I asked Dawes if there was anything different about her, anything at all. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said one thing. He said when he found her, she was sitting on a rock beside the trail, with her right leg extended and her left knee bent, and she was looking down the mountain in the direction of the trailhead. He said she was smiling. Not at him, not at anything he could see. She was smiling at the mountain below her with an expression that he said looked like recognition, like she was watching something approach from far away, and she knew what it was before it arrived. I went back to the trailhead. Patricia was still there. Her husband was loading her pack into the SUV. I asked her, as casually as I could, if she'd seen anyone else on the trail that day. She thought about it. She said she hadn't. She said the trail had been empty, which she'd found unusual for an October Sunday. She said it had felt like she was the only person on the mountain. The report was filed. Barnes wrote it up with the clinical, neutral language that official documents require, noting that 2 rangers had independently reported locating the same missing person at different positions on the trail at approximately the same time, and that one of the located subjects had departed the ranger station before identification could be fully confirmed. The file is closed. Patricia Embry is alive and well and hiking the Blue Ridge with her husband, and she has no knowledge that a second version of herself was found on the same mountain on the same afternoon, sitting on a rock with the same injury and the same clothes, telling the same story. Dawes transferred to a district in Virginia the following spring. He didn't say it was because of the incident, but he didn't say it wasn't. I asked him once, before he left, what he thought had happened. He looked at me with those vacant eyes and said he didn't think anything had happened. He said something had happened, but thinking wasn't the right tool for understanding it. He said the woman he found was real. He said her ankle was swollen. He said she was warm when he touched her arm to help her stand. He said she was real, the way I was real, and the mountain was real, and the trail was real, and whatever category of experience the word real describes, she was in it. I still work SAR in the district. I still hike the profile trail near Grandfather Mountain. And sometimes, on October afternoons when the light comes through the canopy at the angle that turns the forest into stained glass, I think about the second Patricia Embry, the one who was sitting on a rock 2 miles from the real one, smiling down the mountain, watching something approach. And I wonder what she was. And I wonder where she went when she walked out the back door of the ranger station. And I wonder if she's still on the mountain, sitting on a rock beside the trail with her right leg extended and her left knee bent, calm and coherent and pleasant, waiting for the next search team to find her and walk her down and bring her to a parking lot where a husband is waiting for a wife who is already there. I patrol a section of backcountry in the Pisgah National Forest that covers about 12 square miles of drainage along the upper reaches of a creek that I won't name because the site I'm going to describe is still there, and the last thing it needs is attention from people who treat it as a curiosity rather than what it is, which is something I don't have a word for. The section includes about a dozen dispersed campsites along the creek, informal spots that developed over decades of recreational use, and that the Forest Service has designated as official sites, with the understanding that designation is mainly a way of concentrating impact rather than preventing it. My job is to check these sites regularly, monitor them for compliance with leave no trace principles, clean up what people leave behind, repair fire rings, and document any damage to vegetation or water quality that might require the site to be closed for rehabilitation. Most of the sites are what you'd expect. Some are clean, some are trashed, some are used so infrequently that the forest is reclaiming them, the fire ring stones scattered by floods, the ground cover growing back over the cleared earth. People are predictable in their impact. Heavy use sites near the trailhead are dirtier than remote sites further up the drainage. Weekend sites are dirtier than weekday sites. Sites near water are dirtier than sites on ridges. The pattern is consistent and unsurprising, and after 7 years of this work, I can predict with reasonable accuracy what I'll find at any given site on any given visit, except for Site 9. Site 9 is about 4 miles up the creek from the nearest trailhead, far enough that casual day hikers don't reach it, and close enough that experienced backpackers consider it a reasonable first-night destination. It's set on a flat bench above the creek, maybe 30 feet from the water, sheltered by a stand of old hemlocks that survived the adelgid infestation and that provide a canopy so dense that the site stays dry in all but the heaviest rain. It's a good campsite, well-positioned, well-drained, protected from wind, with easy water access and a natural fire ring built from creek stones that some unknown person assembled years ago. It's the kind of site that experienced backcountry users recognize immediately as a place that has been used well and often by people who know what they're doing. The first time I noticed something unusual about Site 9 was in my second year of patrol. I hiked in on a Tuesday morning in late September to do a routine check. The site was empty, no tent, no pack, no evidence of recent habitation, but it was clean. Not just clean, immaculate. The fire ring stones were arranged in a perfect circle, each stone touching the ones beside it, the gaps between them uniform, the height of the ring consistent all the way around. The ash inside the ring was gone, not scattered, not partially removed, gone. The interior of the ring showed bare dirt without a trace of the charcoal and ash that accumulates from even a single fire. The ground around the ring was swept, not raked, not kicked clean with a boot, swept, the surface showing marks that ran in parallel lines from one side of the site to the other with the even, consistent spacing of a tool drawn across the surface, in a single, continuous motion. The logs that served as seating, two sections of fallen hemlock that previous campers had positioned near the fire ring, were placed at exact distances from the ring, equidistant from each other and from the center, positioned with a symmetry that looked deliberate. The cleared area around the site was circular. Leaf litter had been removed in a ring that extended about 15 feet from the fire ring in every direction. The boundary between the swept ground and the forest floor as sharp and as precise as a line drawn with a ruler. Inside the circle, the ground was bare, the surface swept to a smooth, even finish that showed no footprints, no boot marks, no impression of any kind. Outside the circle, the normal accumulation of leaves and twigs and decomposing organic matter that constitutes a forest floor in September. The transition was instantaneous. 1 inch of swept dirt, the next inch, leaf litter 3 inches deep. I noted it in my report as an unusually well-maintained site and moved on. I came back 2 weeks later. Same thing. Immaculate, fire ring perfect, ground swept, logs positioned, leaf circle sharp and precise. No permit had been issued for the site. Nobody had registered to camp there. The site was empty and clean, and looked like it had been prepared for an inspection that nobody had announced. I started paying closer attention. I visited Site 9 on irregular days and at irregular times, trying to catch whoever was maintaining it. Morning visits, afternoon visits. I hiked in after dark once, arriving around 9 in the evening with a headlamp. The site was empty. It was immaculate. The sweep marks on the ground were fresh. The parallel lines in the dirt still sharp-edged, suggesting that whatever had cleaned the site had done so within the last few hours. But I'd been on the trail since late afternoon, and I hadn't passed anyone. Nobody had hiked past me in either direction. The trail to Site 9 is a single track with no alternate routes, and anyone maintaining the site would have had to walk the same path I walked. I checked the sweep marks more carefully on my next visit. They weren't broom marks. I've seen what broom bristles do to dirt, and this wasn't it. The marks were wider, maybe 6 inches across, with a smooth, uniform texture that suggested a single flat surface being dragged across the ground, rather than multiple bristles. Not a rake, which leaves parallel grooves with gaps. Not a branch, which leaves irregular scratches. Something flat and wide, drawn across the surface with consistent pressure and consistent speed, producing marks that ran from one edge of the cleared circle to the other without interruption. I set up a trail camera, a standard infrared wildlife camera, the kind the Forest Service uses for bear monitoring and visitor counts, mounted on a hemlock at the edge of the site about 5 feet off the ground, aimed at the fire ring in the center of the cleared circle. The camera was set to record continuously in time-lapse mode, capturing one frame every 10 seconds from dusk to dawn. The first 3 nights showed nothing. The site sat empty in the green-tinted infrared images, the fire ring and the logs and the swept ground visible in the night vision mode. Undisturbed from frame to frame, the only movement the occasional passage of a moth or a bat through the upper edge of the frame. Normal, expected. 3 nights of nothing. On the 4th night, at 3:12 in the morning, the site changed. I was reviewing the footage at my desk the next day, scrubbing through the time-lapse frames at accelerated speed. When the movement caught my eye, I slowed the playback to real time and watched. The leaves moved first. The leaf litter at the edge of the cleared circle, the boundary line where the swept ground met the forest floor, began to shift. The leaves moved outward, pushed from the center of the site toward the perimeter. Not scattered by wind, but swept, moved in a mass with the organized, directional motion of material being pushed by a tool. The sweep progressed across the site in parallel lines, starting at the far edge of the circle and working toward the camera, each pass clearing a strip of ground about 6 inches wide. The leaves and debris pushed to the edge and deposited at the boundary with the precision of a groundskeeper maintaining a baseball infield. The stones in the fire ring adjusted. One by one, the creek stones shifted, rotating in place, moving inward or outward by fractions of an inch. The small, careful movements of objects being arranged by hands that cared about the result. Each stone settled into its new position with a finality that suggested satisfaction. The slight rocking motion of a stone finding its seat on uneven ground and coming to rest. The logs moved, both of them, the hemlock sections that served as seating, slid across the ground in short, incremental movements, adjusting their distance from the fire ring and from each other until the symmetry was restored. The equal spacing that I'd been documenting for 2 years, reestablished with the same mathematical precision. The entire process took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of footage showing a campsite being cleaned, deorganized, and arranged with meticulous care. And in 20 minutes of continuous recording, the camera captured no image of whatever was doing it. The infrared sensor detected no heat signature, no animal, no person, no shape or shadow or disturbance in the air. The leaves moved, the stones moved, the logs moved, but the thing moving them was invisible to a camera designed to detect the body heat of a warm-blooded animal at 100 feet in total darkness. I sat at my desk, and I watched the footage 3 times. I noted the timestamp, the duration, and the sequence of events. I saved the file, and I backed it up, and I wrote a report that described what the footage showed with the clinical, dispassionate language that incident reports require. Then I took the footage and the report to my supervisor, a man named Caldwell who had been running backcountry operations in the Pisgah for 22 years and who had seen enough anomalies in the forest to fill a filing cabinet. Caldwell watched the footage. He watched it once at normal speed and once at half speed, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and was quiet for about 30 seconds. Then he looked at me and said, "Some sites take care of themselves." He said it the way you say something that you've said before and that you know doesn't explain anything, but that serves as the only response you've authorized yourself to give. He said it like a warning, not a warning about the site, a warning about the question. As if asking what cleaning Site 9 was a line that, once crossed, would lead to answers that were worse than not knowing. I asked him what he meant. He said there are sites in this forest that have been maintained since before the Forest Service existed. He said the Cherokee knew about them. He said the settlers who came after the Cherokee knew about them. He said the Forest Service has known about them since Pisgah was designated in 1916. He said the policy is to leave them alone. He said the policy has always been to leave them alone. I asked who was maintaining them. He looked at me with the steady, weighted gaze of a man who has carried information for 22 years that he is not going to share with me, regardless of how directly I ask. He said I already answered that. Some sites take care of themselves. I removed the trail camera. I filed my report. I continue to patrol Site 9 on my regular schedule, and every time I visit, the site is immaculate. The fire ring is perfect. The ground is swept. The logs are positioned with mathematical symmetry. The circle of cleared ground is sharp and precise, and whatever sweeps it does so with a consistency that has not varied in the 7 years I've been monitoring it. I don't camp at Site 9. I've never spent a night there and I never will, not because Caldwell warned me off it, because the footage showed me something that I can't reconcile with my understanding of the physical world, objects moving without a mover, a space being tended by something that cares about its condition with a devotion that exceeds anything I've seen from a human caretaker. And whatever tends that site does so at 3 in the morning, in the dark, invisible to infrared, patient and precise and thorough. And it has been doing so for longer than the Forest Service has existed, longer than the settlers, longer than the Cherokee were willing to talk about. Something lives at Site 9, or something visits, or something considers that particular bend of the creek, and that particular stand of hemlocks, and that particular circle of swept ground to be its place, the way a homeowner considers their property to be their place, and it maintains it the way a homeowner maintains a yard, with regular attention and careful work, and a standard of presentation that does not tolerate disorder. And I wonder what would happen if I camped there. If I pitched a tent in the cleared circle, built a fire in the perfect ring, sat on the positioned logs, and waited for 3 in the morning. Would it clean around me the way it cleans around the stones and the logs, adjusting its routine to accommodate my presence? Or would it consider me debris, something that needed to be swept to the edge, something that didn't belong inside the circle, something that needed to be moved? The tower is called White Top Lookout, though it's not on White Top Mountain, and I've never been able to determine who named it or why. It sits on a ridge at about 4,500 feet near the Virginia-North Carolina border, in a section of the Jefferson National Forest that's remote enough to make the word remote to feel insufficient. The nearest paved road is 7 miles away. The nearest town, if you can call it a town, is a crossroads with a gas station and a church about 12 miles to the northeast. The tower is accessed by a Forest Service road that climbs the ridge in a series of switchbacks so tight that you can't drive them faster than 10 miles per hour without putting your truck in the ditch, and the road ends at a small gravel turnaround where you park and hike the last quarter mile up a footpath to the tower itself. The tower was built in 1943 as part of the wartime fire detection network that the Forest Service established across the southern Appalachians. It's a standard lookout design, a 14 by 14 room mounted on a steel frame about 30 feet above the ground, with windows on all four sides and a catwalk that wraps around the exterior. The room contains a cot, a desk, a wood stove, a propane cook stove, a fire finder mounted on a pedestal in the center, and a VHF radio that connects to the district office in a town about 30 miles to the north. The radio is the only means of communication. Cell signal doesn't exist at that elevation, or it does in the theoretical sense that a signal is present somewhere in the atmosphere, but not in the practical sense that a phone can find it and use it. The tower is, by design and by geography, isolated in a way that most people in the 21st century never experience. You are alone up there, completely, continuously, absolutely alone, with the wind and the view and the radio and whatever thoughts your mind produces when the usual inputs of human contact and digital stimulation are removed. I took the assignment in the summer of 2021. Fire season in the southern Appalachians runs from roughly April through November, and the Forest Service staffs the lookout towers during the highest risk months, which in that section of Virginia are August through October. The rotation was 2 weeks on, 1 week off, with resupply every 7 days by a ranger who drove up the forest road and hiked the last quarter mile with a pack of food, water, and propane canisters. My job was to watch, to sit in the room at the top of the tower with the fire finder and the binoculars and the radio and scan the horizon in every direction for the first sign of smoke, and to report whatever I saw to the district office, which would dispatch a crew if the smoke warranted investigation. The first week was fine, better than fine. The solitude was a relief. After a year of working at a busy ranger station where the phone never stopped and the visitors never stopped, and the requests for attention from 100 different directions made every day feel like an exercise in triage. The tower was quiet. The view was enormous, a 360-degree panorama of the Blue Ridge that extended 50 miles on a clear day, the ridges stacking up against each other in shades of blue and gray that faded to white at the horizon. I watched the sunrise and the sunset, and the weather systems that moved across the landscape with the slow, visible progression of clouds and wind, and the particular light that the mountains produce when the atmosphere is heavy with moisture. I read. I cooked simple meals. I talked to the dispatcher at scheduled check-in times, morning and evening, and otherwise the radio was silent. The radio. I need to describe the radio because it's central to what happened. It was a standard Forest Service VHF transceiver, mounted on the desk beside the window that faced north, toward the district office. It operated on a dedicated frequency assigned to the Fire Lookout Network, a frequency that was used exclusively for communication between the tower and the dispatch center. Other agencies operated on different frequencies. Other towers had their own channels. The frequency I was on was, for all practical purposes, a private line between the dispatcher and me, and traffic on it was limited to my twice-daily check-ins and any fire reports I needed to file. Outside of those scheduled transmissions, the radio was quiet. A low hiss of static when the squelch was open, the white noise of an empty frequency, the sound of electromagnetic nothing. It happened on the 8th night, a Thursday, around midnight. I was lying on the cot reading by the light of a battery lantern, the wood stove ticking as it cooled, the wind pushing against the tower with the steady, rhythmic pressure that high-altitude winds maintain through the night. The radio was on, squelch open, the low static hiss providing the ambient background noise that I'd gotten used to over the previous week. I was half reading, half drifting towards sleep, the book open on my chest, the lantern dimming as the batteries started to go. The static changed, not louder, not different in pitch. It thickened. The uniform, random hiss of an empty frequency developed a texture, a pattern, as if the randomness was organizing itself around a signal that was trying to push through from underneath. I opened my eyes and looked at the radio. The static continued, thicker now, pulsing slightly with a rhythm that sounded almost biological, like breathing. Then my name, spoken clearly. My first name, a pause, and then my last name, pronounced correctly, with the accent on the right syllables and the vowels shaped the way they're shaped when someone who knows your name says it rather than reads it. The voice was distant, not quiet, distant, as if the speaker was far away and the signal was traveling through something denser than air to reach me. But the words were perfectly intelligible. My name, said once, and then the static resumed, the thick, pulsing hiss that had replaced the normal background noise. I sat up. I picked up the microphone and keyed it and said, "This is White Top Lookout, who's calling?" I released the key. Silence. Not static. Silence. The frequency went completely dead for about 5 seconds, as if the act of my transmission had cleared the air of everything, including the background noise that should have been constant. Then the static returned. And then, about 30 seconds later, the voice again. My name, first name, pause, last name, followed by something else, a phrase. Words that started clearly and then dissolved, the consonants softening and the vowels stretching and the meaning bleeding away into the static, the way a signal bleeds away when the source moves out of range. I caught the beginning of the phrase, maybe 2 or 3 words, but they didn't connect into anything I could understand. The rest was absorbed by the static, consumed by it, as if the frequency itself was eating the words before they could reach me. I called the district office. The dispatcher on the night shift was a woman named Sheila, who had been working dispatch for the Forest Service for over a decade. I told her someone was transmitting on the lookout frequency. She checked her board. She said nobody had transmitted on that frequency in the last hour. She said the only active units on the network were me and the Hanging Rock Tower, which was 50 miles to the northeast and operating on a different channel. She said the frequency was clean on her end. No signal, no transmission, no voice. I told her what I'd heard. My name, spoken clearly, followed by words I couldn't make out. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd log it and asked if I wanted her to stay on the line. I said no. I said I was fine. She said, "Call back if it happens again." I said I would. It happened again at 12:15. The same sequence. The static thickening, the rhythm developing, the voice emerging from the texture of the noise. My name, first name, pause, last name, and then the phrase, "clearer this time," or maybe I was listening harder, the first few words hanging in the air before the static consumed the rest. I concentrated. I pressed the speaker against my ear. The words were there, just beneath the surface of the noise, close enough to almost hear, distant enough to remain unintelligible. It was like listening to someone speak through a wall, the rhythm of speech present but the content just beyond the threshold of comprehension. 12:30, again, same voice, same pattern, same dissolving phrase. 12:45, again, 1 o'clock, again, every 15 minutes, with a precision that ruled out random atmospheric interference or signal bleed from another frequency. Whatever was producing the voice was operating on a schedule, transmitting at regular intervals, calling my name, and then saying something that I was meant to hear, but that the medium of the radio could not quite deliver. I stopped calling the district office after the second occurrence. Sheila had logged the first report, T, and there was nothing she could do from 30 miles away that would change what was coming through the speaker. I sat on the couch, and I listened. Each time, the voice said my name with the same clarity and the same distant quality. Each time, the phrase that followed started in the range of comprehension and faded before I could hold it. I started writing down what I could catch. Fragments, syllables, sounds that might have been words or might have been artifacts of the static patterning itself around a signal I wasn't equipped to decode. It continued until dawn. The last transmission came at 5:45, about 20 minutes before sunrise. My name, the phrase, the dissolving, the static. And then, as the first light appeared on the eastern horizon and the sky shifted from black to the deep blue of pre-dawn, the static thinned. The thickened, pulsing texture that had characterized the frequency since midnight returned to the normal, uniform hiss of an empty channel. The radio was clean. The voice was gone. The frequency was mine again. I reported the incident in detail during my morning check-in. The day shift dispatcher, a man named Rollins, listened without interrupting and said he'd pass it up the chain. That afternoon, when the resupply ranger hiked up with my weekly provisions, he mentioned the report. He said Rollins had told him about it. He said it wasn't the first time. He told me the tower had a history. He said it the way people in the Forest Service say things that they know are true and that they know sound crazy, with a deliberateness that dares you to laugh. He said rangers had been reporting voice transmissions on the lookout frequency for decades. Not every ranger, not every season, but enough, over enough years, that the reports had accumulated into an unofficial file that nobody in the district office talked about, but that everybody in the district office knew existed. He said the reports were always the same. A voice, distant but clear, calling the ranger by name, followed by words that couldn't quite be made out. Always at night, always at 15-minute intervals, always gone by dawn. I asked him who it was. He said nobody knew. I asked him if anyone had ever understood the phrase. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said one ranger, back in the 80s, had claimed to have understood part of it. He said the ranger had reported that the voice was giving directions, a bearing and a distance, come to a specific point in the forest, at a specific compass heading, at a specific distance from the tower. The ranger had written down the coordinates and hiked to the location the next day and found nothing. An empty section of forest on the north slope of the ridge, unremarkable in every way. He'd filed his report and finished his rotation and never staffed the tower again. I finished my 2-week rotation. The voice came every night for the remaining 6 nights. Same pattern, same intervals, same dissolving phrase. I listened to it the way you listen to rain on a roof, with an awareness that doesn't fully engage, a monitoring that the mind performs while the rest of the consciousness retreats to a safer distance. I never understood the phrase. I never wrote down coordinates. I never followed directions to a point in the forest that a voice from the radio was trying to lead me to. But I think about it. On quiet nights, in my house in town, when the background noise of civilization thins out enough to let the silence through, I think about the voice on the frequency, and the words I couldn't hear, and the ranger in the 80s who heard them clearly enough to extract a bearing and a distance, and who hiked to the coordinates and found nothing. And I wonder if nothing is what's there during the day, and if something else is there at night. And if the voice on the radio isn't calling from the tower's frequency at all, but from the location it's trying to describe, transmitting from a point in the forest that exists on a compass heading and at a specific distance, and that can only be reached by someone who listens long enough and carefully enough to hear the directions through the static. And I wonder what's waiting there. And I wonder if the voice will keep calling until someone finally arrives. The call came in on a Monday morning in early June of 2021. Overdue backpacker in the Shining Rock Wilderness, a 28-year-old man named Kyle Brewer from Asheville, who had registered at the Art Loeb Trailhead for a 3-night solo trip the previous Thursday and failed to check out by his stated return date of Sunday evening. His emergency contact, a girlfriend who lived in the same apartment complex, had called the ranger station at 8 in the morning when he didn't come home and didn't answer his phone. His car, a gray Subaru with an Appalachian Trail sticker on the bumper, was still at the trailhead. The keys were not in the vehicle. The registration form on file at the station listed his intended route as a loop along the Art Loeb Trail, with a planned camp on the ridge near Shining Rock itself, a popular backcountry destination that sits above 5,000 feet and offers views of the Blue Ridge that draw experienced hikers from across the southeast. I was part of the initial search team, 4 rangers and 2 volunteer SAR members, dispatched Monday afternoon to work the trail system in the area of Kyle Brewer's registered route. The plan was standard for an overdue hiker in a wilderness area with established trails. 2 teams, one working from each direction of the loop, converged in the area where the subject was most likely to have camped based on his stated itinerary. The weather had been clear and warm for the previous 5 days. No storms, no temperature extremes, no conditions that would have created an emergency for a prepared backpacker. The terrain, while remote, was not technical. The trails were well maintained and well blazed. There was no obvious reason that an experienced hiker with a 3-night pack and a registered route should have failed to return. We located his campsite on Tuesday afternoon, about 6 miles from the trailhead, on a ridge saddle near the junction of the Art Loeb Trail and a spur that leads to the Shining Rock outcrop. The site was on a flat bench just below the ridgeline, sheltered from the prevailing wind by a stand of spruce fir that grows at that elevation, a natural campsite that experienced backpackers use regularly because the ground is level and the trees provide windbreak, and the water source, a small spring, is about 200 yards downhill. The tent was standing, a 2-person backpacking tent, orange and gray, the kind that weighs about 4 pounds and sets up with trekking poles, properly pitched with the guy lines staked and the rainfly taut and the vestibule oriented downhill, the way an experienced camper would set it up. The tent was in good condition, with no tears or damage, and the fabric was dry and clean. The door was zipped closed. I unzipped the door. Inside the tent, the sleeping bag was unrolled on the sleeping pad, a mummy-style down bag rated to 20 degrees. The bag was unzipped, the top half folded back, the position you'd find it in if someone had been sleeping in it, and pushed the upper portion down during the night because they were warm. On the sleeping pad, beside the bag, was a phone. An iPhone in a black case. The screen is dark, dead battery. A headlamp sat on the floor of the tent near the head of the sleeping pad, the kind you'd place within reach before turning it off for the night. A paperback book was face down beside the headlamp, open to a page about halfway through. In the vestibule of the tent, arranged neatly on the ground sheet, were his boots. A pair of Salomon trail boots, broken in, laced loosely, sitting side by side with the care of a person who takes their boots off at the tent door and places them where they'll be easy to find in the morning. His socks were stuffed inside the boots. Beside the boots was a fleece jacket, folded. His pack was outside the tent, leaning against one of the trekking poles that served as the tent's structural support. A 60-liter backpacking pack, dark green, with the compression straps buckled and the top lid secured. Inside the pack was food, 3 days' worth of dehydrated meals and energy bars and trail mix, the kind of carefully planned backcountry food supply that an experienced backpacker packs when they know exactly how long they'll be out and how many calories they'll need. A water filter was in the side pocket. 2 full water bottles were in the mesh pockets on the outside of the pack. A camp stove and fuel canister were in the top lid pocket. Everything was there. Everything a person needs to survive in the backcountry for 3 nights was present and accounted for, arranged with the organized, methodical neatness of a man who knew how to live in the wilderness, and who had set up his campsite with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it many times before. The tent, the sleeping bag, the boots, the phone, the food, the water, the stove, the pack. The only thing missing from the complete inventory of a backpacker's campsite was the backpacker. We searched a 2-mile radius around the campsite. Then we expanded to 3, then 5. Dogs were brought in on Wednesday morning, 2 tracking dogs handled by a volunteer team from Buncombe County. The dogs were given a scent article from Kyle's apartment and brought to the campsite. They circled the tent. They circled the camp area. They did not track. There was no scent trail leaving the campsite. The dogs returned to the tent and sat down, which is the behavior-trained tracking dogs exhibit when the scent they've been given exists in the immediate area, but does not extend in any direction. The scent was at the tent. It was not anywhere else. Kyle Brewer had been at his campsite, and then he had not been at his campsite, and between those 2 states, there was no path. A helicopter flew in grid patterns over the wilderness area on Wednesday and Thursday. The crew scanned the ridgeline, the drainages, and the open areas where a person might be visible from the air. Nothing. Ground teams walked grid searches of the terrain surrounding the campsite in expanding squares, covering every foot of forest floor within 5 miles. Nothing. No clothing snagged on branches. No footprints in the soft soil along the spring trail. No disturbance in the undergrowth that would indicate a person had pushed through it. No tracks. No marks. No evidence of any kind that Kyle Brewer had left his campsite by any route in any direction at any point after he pitched his tent on that ridge. I kept coming back to the boots. The boots in the vestibule, laced loosely, socks tucked inside, sitting side by side where he'd placed them before getting into the tent. A person who leaves a campsite in the backcountry puts on their boots. It's the first thing you do. It's instinctive, automatic, the physical prerequisite for any movement in wilderness terrain. You don't walk away from a campsite in the Shining Rock Wilderness without boots. The ground is rocky and root-covered and steep, and a barefoot person would be injured within 100 yards. And yet the boots were there, placed carefully, waiting to be put on by feet that never came back for them. I kept coming back to the phone. Dead battery, lying on the sleeping pad, positioned the way a phone is positioned when someone has been looking at it in their sleeping bag and set it down beside them when they finished. The battery had been alive when he'd used it last. It had died at some point after that, drained by whatever background processes phones run when nobody's using them. The last timestamp the digital forensics team recovered was a photograph taken at 9:14 on Thursday evening, the first night of his trip. A photograph of the sunset from the ridge, the blue ridge glowing in the colors that draw people to these mountains, the same view that 1,000 hikers have photographed from that same spot. 9:14 Thursday evening. He took a picture of the sunset, he went to bed, and between 9:14 and whenever the battery died, something happened that made him leave his tent, without his boots, or his phone, or his food, or his water, or any of the things that a living person needs to survive in the mountains. The search was called off after 5 days. The case was turned over to the county sheriff's office, which conducted its own investigation and arrived at the same conclusion that SAR had arrived at, which was no conclusion at all. No evidence of foul play, no evidence of animal attack, no evidence of a fall, an injury, or a medical event. No evidence that Kyle Brewer had done anything other than go to sleep in his tent on a Thursday night in June and cease to exist at some point before morning. The case file is still open. It will remain open because there is no resolution to close it with. The tent was dismantled and returned to the girlfriend along with the pack, the boots, the phone, the sleeping bag, and all the other possessions of a man who had packed for 3 nights in the wilderness and used only one of them. I don't know what she did with the gear. I don't know if she kept it, or donated it, or threw it away. I know that I helped pack it out, carrying the backpack down the trail on my shoulders with the food still inside and the water bottles still full and the weight of it pressing against my back with the particular heaviness of objects that are waiting for a person who won't return. The tent is what I think about, not Kyle. I didn't know Kyle. I know his name and his age, and the color of his car, and the book he was reading, and the photograph he took of the sunset. But I didn't know him. What I knew was his tent. Standing on the ridge with the guy line staked and the rainfly taut and the sleeping bag inside, unzipped and empty, the impression of his body still faintly visible in the loft of the down, the shape of a person preserved in the material that had been keeping them warm when they disappeared. The tent looked like a shell, like the shed skin of something that had grown out of it and left. It stood there on the ridge in the June sun, with the door zipped and the boots in the vestibule and the sleeping bag open and waiting. And it looked for all the world like someone had been lifted out of it, straight up, through the fabric, through the rainfly, through the air above the ridge, lifted cleanly and completely, without disturbing the zipper or the guy lines, or the position of the boots, or the placement of the phone on the sleeping pad. Taken out of the tent the way you take a letter out of an envelope, leaving the envelope intact and empty and sealed and standing where you found it. I've worked in SAR for 9 years since then. I've responded to dozens of missing hiker calls, and most of them end with a found hiker. The ones that don't end with a body, or a piece of clothing, or a track, or some fragment of physical evidence that connects the missing person to the landscape they disappeared into. There is always something, a boot print, a wrapper, a broken branch, a scent trail, something that says the person was here and went there, and the there is where we need to look. Kyle Brewer left nothing. The dogs found no trail. The ground teams found no tracks. The helicopter found no body. The forensics found no evidence. He was in his 10T, and then he wasn't T, and the space between those two facts is empty, not mysterious, not suspicious, empty, a void where an explanation should be and isn't. And I think about the ridges at night, the Shining Rock Wilderness in the dark, the spruce fir forests and the rocky outcrops and the open balds where the wind blows constantly, and the elevation puts you above the clouds, and the nearest road is 6 miles away. Why? and the nearest person is further. I think about tents on ridges. Orange and gray fabric stretched over trekking poles, glowing faintly when a headlamp is on inside, the shape of a person visible through the fabric as a shadow. I think about the moment between sleep and whatever comes after sleep for the people who don't wake up where they fell asleep. The moment when Kyle Brewer was in his sleeping bag with his phone beside him and his boots in the vestibule, and then he wasn't. And I wonder if he knew, if there was a moment of awareness between being inside the tent and being outside of everything, if he felt himself go, or if it was like sleep, like the deep, instant, total sleep that takes you without transition. One moment you're awake and the next you're not, and the space between has no duration and no content. And the tent stands empty, and the boots wait in the vestibule, and the sleeping bag holds the shape of a body that will never fill it again. The first time I heard about the stairs was at a training session in Asheville, in my second year with the Forest Service. It was 2016, and I was still new enough to the backcountry division that I listened more than I talked, absorbing the institutional knowledge that experienced rangers carry the way old houses, carry the smell of the people who've lived in them, not in the official manuals or the training materials, but in the conversations that happen after hours, on porches and in trucks and around the tables at the bar, where the Nantahala District Rangers gathered on Friday evenings to drink beer and decompress from a week in the woods. A ranger named Purcell, who'd been in the Nantahala for 20 years, and who had the particular authority that comes from 2 decades of walking the same forest, was telling a story about a survey he'd done in the Snowbird Mountains, a remote section of the district that borders the Cherokee National Forest to the south. He was describing the terrain and the conditions and the usual details that rangers include when telling work stories, and then he mentioned, casually, almost as an aside, that he'd come across a set of stairs. Someone at the table asked what he meant. Purcell said stairs. A staircase. In the woods. He said it the way you'd say, "I saw a bear," as a factual observation that didn't require elaboration. Someone laughed. Someone else didn't. The ranger sitting beside me, a woman named Torres who'd been in the service for about 8 years, leaned over and said quietly, "You'll hear about the stairs." She said it as a statement of inevitability, the way you'd tell a new employee that they'll eventually learn where the break room is. She said every backcountry ranger finds them eventually. She said the ones who've been around long enough don't joke about it. I filed it away. The way you file away anything that sounds like campfire mythology when you're new to a profession that operates in wild spaces where mythology accumulates like leaf litter, layer upon layer of stories that may or may not correspond to anything real, but that persist because the forest gives them room to exist. I didn't think about the stairs for 2 years. Then I found my own. It was October of 2018. I was doing a boundary survey in a remote section of the Nantahala National Forest, working a property line that ran along a ridge about 8 miles from the nearest maintained road. Boundary surveys are routine work, walking the line between national forest land and adjacent private or state property, checking for encroachment, verifying that the boundary markers are intact, and documenting any changes that need to be reported. The work is solitary and slow, and it takes you into sections of the forest that nobody else visits because there's no trail and no destination and no reason for a recreational user to be there. You're walking a line on a map through terrain that exists, as far as most people are concerned, only as a green shape on a computer screen. The section I was surveying was old-growth forest, or close to it, the kind of timber that survived the logging era because the terrain was too steep or too remote for extraction. The trees were large, tulip, poplar, and oak and hickory, with trunks 3 and 4 feet in diameter, the canopy high and the understory open, the cathedral-like interior that old forests develop when the upper canopy shades out everything beneath it, and the ground becomes a floor of leaf litter and moss, and the smooth, massive roots of trees that have been anchoring themselves to the mountain for centuries. I was about 2 miles into the day's survey, working along the contour of a ridge that dropped steeply on both sides into drainages that hadn't been named on any map I'd seen. The GPS put me well inside the national forest boundary, far from any property line, which was unusual because I should have been near the boundary I was surveying. I checked my position twice. The GPS was accurate. I drifted off the boundary line during the walk, following a feature of the terrain that had led me deeper into the forest interior than my survey required. I was about to correct my course when I saw them, the stairs, standing in a gap between two large oaks, rising from the forest floor with the abrupt, impossible presence of an object that does not belong to the world it occupies. A staircase. 12 steps of poured concrete, the color and texture of the standard structural concrete used in residential construction, with a metal railing on the left side, the kind of simple tubular steel railing that you'd find in a mid-century apartment building or a public housing project. The stairs rose from the leaf litter at a standard angle, each tread about 10 inches deep and 7 inches high. The dimensions that building codes have required for decades, proportioned for the human body, designed to be climbed. They ended in the air. 12 steps up, about 10 feet from the forest floor, the staircase simply stopped. The top step was a clean, flat surface of poured concrete, the edge sharp and precise, terminating without a landing or a platform or any continuation. The railing ended at the same height, the tubular steel cut clean, not broken, not bent, not rusted at the termination point, cut. As if the staircase had been manufactured to be exactly this tall and no taller, as if the ending was intentional rather than the result of damage or deterioration. There was no building, no foundation beneath the stairs, no concrete pad, no footing, no evidence that the staircase was anchored to anything in the ground. The base of the stairs simply met the leaf litter, the bottom step resting on the forest floor, the way a piece of furniture rests on a floor, present and stable and unexplained. There was no rubble around the stairs, no broken concrete, no fallen walls, no fragments of brick or wood or any building material that would suggest a structure had once surrounded the staircase and collapsed, leaving the stairs standing alone. The forest floor around the stairs was undisturbed. Leaf litter, moss, the roots of the oaks, the normal, uninterrupted surface of a forest that has been growing undisturbed for a very long time. The concrete was clean, not weathered, not stained with ag, or rain, or the organic residue that accumulates on any outdoor surface over time. The stairs looked new, not recently constructed, which would have meant disturbed ground and tool marks and the smell of fresh concrete. New in the way that something looks when it has been preserved, maintained in a state of original condition by a process that prevents the normal deterioration that time inflicts on everything. The surface was smooth and even, and the color was the uniform gray of concrete that has never been rained on, never been frozen, never been baked by sun, never been touched by the weather, that touches everything else in the forest. I stood about 20 feet away, and I looked at the stairs, and the stairs looked back at me with the patient, neutral indifference of an object that exists for a purpose it doesn't need to explain. I felt something. Not dread, not fear, something closer to vertigo, the disorientation that comes from seeing something that your brain cannot process through any available category of understanding. Stairs belong to buildings. Stairs connect one level of a structure to another. Stairs have a context, a before and an after, a ground floor and an upper floor, and the space between. These stairs had none of that. They rose from the forest floor to a point 10 feet up, and they ended. And the ending was the point. The top of the stairs opened onto nothing. Air, the canopy of the forest, the branches of the oaks that framed the staircase on either side. Nothing. I didn't climb them. I want to be clear about that, because the question people ask when I tell this story is always, did you climb them? And the answer is no, and the reason is not rational. The stairs were solid. The concrete was intact. The railing was secure. There was no structural reason not to climb 12 steps of poured concrete in good condition. But something about the top, the clean termination where the landing should have been and wasn't, the abrupt edge where the staircase opened onto empty air, produced a physical response in my body that overrode any curiosity my mind might have generated. My stomach tightened, my hands went cold. The back of my neck produced the particular crawling sensation that the body generates when it has detected a threat that the mind hasn't identified yet. The stairs were wrong. Not dangerous in the way that a cliff is dangerous or a bear is dangerous. Dangers that can be assessed, mitigated, and managed. Wrong in the way that something is wrong when it exists in a place where it cannot exist. and your body knows it before your mind does. S, and the body's response is to not go closer. I photographed them. I took 12 photographs from various angles and distances, documenting the stairs the way I document any anomalous finding on a survey, with the clinical thoroughness of a person who knows that what they're seeing will be questioned and wants the record to be unambiguous. I measured the stairs with the tape on my belt. I recorded the GPS coordinates. I noted the condition, the materials, and the dimensions in my field notebook. And then I walked away. I corrected my course back to the boundary line, and I finished the survey. Y, and I hiked out. T, and I drove to the district office, and I pulled up the photographs on my computer. R, and I looked at them for a long time. I showed them to my supervisor, a man named Caldwell, who ran the backcountry operations for the Nantahala district and who I'd worked under for 2 years. He looked at the photographs on my screen, scrolling through them slowly, his face showing an expression that transitioned from neutral to something harder to read, something that might have been recognition or might have been resignation. He looked at all 12 photographs. Then he turned away from the screen and looked at me. He said, "Don't go back there." He said it with a directness that left no room for negotiation. He said, "If you find stairs in the woods, you mark the coordinates, you walk the other direction, and you don't talk about them." I asked him what they were. He shook his head. I asked if other rangers had found them. He said yes. I asked where. He said not always in the same place. He said they've been reported in the Nantahala, in the Pisgah, in the Cherokee, and in the Monongahela. He said they're always the same. Concrete, railing, 12 steps, clean, ending in the air. He said the coordinates are logged in a file that stays in the district office and doesn't go to the regional database. I asked him why. He looked at me for a long time, the way he looks when he's deciding how much to say. Then he said that some of the rangers who found them climbed them. I asked what happened. He said they came back different. He said it with the weight of a man who has seen what different means and has decided not to describe it. I pressed him. I asked differently. He said one ranger, a woman who'd been in the service for 12 years, climbed a set of stairs in the Snowbird Mountains in 2009 and came down, walked back to the trailhead, drove to the district office, and resigned. Effective immediately. She didn't explain. She didn't discuss it. She left the service and moved to Ohio, and has not, as far as anyone knows, entered a national forest since. Another ranger, a man in the Pisgah, climbed a set in 2014 and came back to work the next day and was fine, seemed fine, acted fine for about 3 weeks. Then he stopped going into the backcountry. He worked the front desk. He worked at the visitor center. He would not set foot on a trail. He retired early. Caldwell said he ran into him at a gas station in Brevard a year later, and the man looked at him and said they're still there. He said the man's eyes when he said it were the eyes of a person who is seeing something that isn't in the room. I didn't go back. I haven't found stairs again in the 6 years since, though I look for them now, which is maybe a different kind of problem. Every time I walk a remote section of the Nantahala, every time I enter old-growth forest far from trails and roads and the maintained landscape of the park, I look between the trees for the shape that doesn't belong. The geometric regularity of poured concrete in a world of organic curves. The straight line of a metal railing against the vertical chaos of tree trunks. I look and I don't find them, and the not finding is both a relief and a frustration, because the photographs on my computer are real, and the GPS coordinates in my notebook are real, and the stairs were there, solid and clean and impossible, rising from the forest floor to a height of 10 feet and ending in the air where something should have been and wasn't. And I think about climbing them, not with desire, with the particular involuntary curiosity that dangerous things produce, the compulsion that makes people look over the edge of a cliff, not because they want to fall, but because the emptiness pulls at something in the brain that needs to know what's down there. The stairs pull at the same thing. The top step, clean and flat and opening onto nothing, asks a question that the body refuses to let the mind answer. What's up there? What do you see from the top? What is the view from a landing that doesn't exist, at the top of a staircase that has no building, in the middle of a forest that has been growing around it for longer than anyone can explain? And the rangers who climbed them know. The woman who moved to Ohio, the man who won't enter the forest, and whoever else is in that file in the district office that doesn't go to the regional database. They climbed 12 steps of clean concrete, and they reached the top, and they saw whatever the top shows you. And whatever it was enough to make them leave. Not the forest, not the job. The entire framework of understanding that allows a person to walk into the woods and believe that the woods are just woods. They climbed the stairs, and they came back down. And the world they came back to was not the same world they'd left at the bottom. Different, Caldwell said. And he wouldn't say how. The shelter sits at about 5,600 feet on the Appalachian Trail near the Roan Highlands, in a section of the trail that runs along the Tennessee-North Carolina border through some of the highest and most exposed terrain in the southern mountains. It's a standard AT shelter, a three-sided wooden structure with a raised sleeping platform and a metal roof and an opening that faces away from the prevailing wind, designed to accommodate 6 to 8 hikers overnight, and maintained by volunteer ridge runners and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. My job, among other things, is to check on it twice a year, once in the spring when the snow melts and the hiking season begins, and once in the fall before the winter closes the high elevations. The visitor log is part of every AT shelter, a waterproof notebook in a plastic box mounted to one of the interior posts, where hikers sign their name and the date and leave a note for the people who come after them. The logs are a tradition that's been part of the trail culture since the trail was built, a running record of the people who pass through, their names, their trail names, their weather reports, their complaints and celebrations, and the occasional drawing or poem that someone leaves to mark the moment. I collect the logs twice a year and mail them to the Trail Conservancy office in Harper's Ferry, where they're archived as part of the historical record of the trail. The shelter near Roan is one of the more remote ones in my section. It's about 4 miles from the nearest trailhead at Carver's Gap, which doesn't sound far until you factor in the elevation and the exposure and the weather that the Roan Highlands produce with a capriciousness that makes planning difficult and prediction impossible. The trail at that elevation crosses open balds, where the wind blows constantly, and the temperature can drop 30 degrees in an hour, and the snow, when it comes with the kind of intensity that closes the trail from December through March. Nobody hikes the Roan in winter. The trail isn't closed officially, because the AT is never closed, but the conditions above 5,000 feet between November and March are severe enough that attempting a winter traverse of the balds is considered reckless by every experienced hiker I know. The shelter sits under snow for most of the winter, the opening packed with drifts, the sleeping platform buried, the structure visible only as a shape under the white surface of the ridge. I collected the winter log in early April of 2023. The snow had melted enough by then that the trail was passable, though patches remained in the shade on the north-facing slopes and the mud was ankle-deep in places. I hiked in on a Thursday morning, checked the shelter's structural condition, replaced a section of roofing that had been damaged by a fallen branch, and collected the log from its plastic box. I slid the notebook into a Ziploc bag. D put it in my pack, K, and hiked out. I didn't look at the log until the following Monday, when I sat down at my desk at the district office to process the spring paperwork. I opened the notebook. The last entry of the fall season was dated November 14th. A thru hiker named Trail Dog who'd written, "The weather is turning and I'm heading south," followed by a smiley face. Standard fare. After that entry, the next legitimate entry was from March 22nd. A section hiker from Johnson City who'd written, "First hike of spring, still snow on the ground, saw a raven." Standard fare. 4 months between entries, November to March. The gap that represents the winter closure when nobody is on the trail and nobody is at the shelter. R, and the notebook sits in its plastic box under the snow. Except the gap wasn't empty. Between November 14th and March 22nd, the notebook was full. Every page, every day. 91 entries covering every date from December 1st through February 28th. 1 entry per day. Each entry consists of a date, a name, and a note. The same note every time. The handwriting varied, not the way different people's handwriting varies, with the broad range of styles and qualities that you see in any visitor log, where dozens of different hands have contributed. The variation was narrower, subtler. Each entry was written in a script that was careful and deliberate and slow, the kind of handwriting that people produce when they're not accustomed to writing, when the physical act of forming letters requires concentration rather than muscle memory. The letters were well-formed but laborious, each one a separate effort, the pen pressed into the paper with a firmness that left impressions on the pages beneath. The handwriting changed from entry to entry in the way that a single person's handwriting might change if they were writing on different days in different conditions with different levels of fatigue. But each entry was signed with a different name. The names were mountain names, the surnames you find in the hollows of western North Carolina and East Tennessee, the Scots, Irish, and English and German names that the original settlers brought to these mountains and that persist in the census records and the graveyards and the rural route mailboxes. Ramsey and Buckner and Shelton and Hensley and Presnell and Silver and Whitaker and Callaway. The first names were old-fashioned, the kind that were common in the 19th and early 20th century and have fallen out of use. Ezekiel and Delilah and Amos and Beulah and Elijah and Hester and Josiah and Myrtle, 91 names across 91 days, each one different, each one the kind of name that belonged to someone who lived in these mountains 100 years ago. I searched the AT hiker databases. Every through hiker and section hiker who registers with the Conservancy is in the system. None of the 91 names appeared. I searched the permit databases for the National Forest. Nothing. I searched the census records for Carter County, Tennessee, and Mitchell County, North Carolina, the two counties that border the Roan Highlands. The surnames were all present, distributed across the historical records going back to the 1800s. But the specific combinations, the first and last names as they appeared in the log, matched nobody. No, O. Ezekiel Ramsey. No, O. Delilah Buckner. No, Amos Shelton. The names were plausible. They sounded real. They belonged to a population that had existed in these mountains for generations. But the specific individuals they referred to were not in any record I could find. The note. Each entry, after the date and the name, included the same two words. Still here, written in the same careful, effortful script as the name and the date. Still here, not a greeting, not a weather report, not a trail condition update, a statement of continued presence. I am still here. We are still here. The people who lived on this mountain before the trail was blazed. D. The shelter was built. AND. The visitor log was placed. In its plastic box are still here. I sat at my desk and I read 91 entries by 91 people who don't exist. And I thought about the shelter at 5,600 feet on the Roan Highlands, buried under 6 feet of snow in December and January. And February, the opening packed with drifts, the sleeping platform invisible, the visitor log sealed in its plastic box in a structure that no living person had entered since November. And I thought about the handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the writing of people for whom literacy was not automatic but achieved, the hard-won penmanship of mountain people in the 19th century who learned to write by necessity rather than education, who formed their letters one at a time, with the focused attention of a skill that had been taught by hand. I showed the log to my supervisor. He looked at the entries. He read the names. He read the notes. Still here, still here, still here, 91 times. He closed the notebook and sat back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said the shelter is on the site of an old settlement. He said before the National Forest and before the trail, the Roan Highlands were grazed by families who ran cattle and sheep on the balds in the summer and lived in cabins on the ridge from spring through fall. He said some of them stayed through the winter. He said not all of them survived. I asked him what that had to do with the log. He said he didn't know. He said the logs from that shelter had been unusual for years. He said the winter entries had started appearing in the early 2000s, the first year the Conservancy had placed a log at that specific shelter. He said the names changed every year, but the note was always the same. Still here. I asked him why nobody had investigated. He looked at me with the expression that my supervisors in the Forest Service have worn whenever I've asked a question that touches the boundary between what the agency acknowledges and what the agency knows. He said, "What would we investigate?" He said the entries are in the log. The names don't match anyone. The shelter is inaccessible in winter. There's no crime. There's no damage. There's no complaint. Someone, or something, is writing names in a notebook in a shelter that's buried in snow at 5,600 feet, and the names belong to a population that lived on this mountain 150 years ago and has been dead for as long. He said, "We send the logs to the Conservancy. We and the Conservancy archives them. And nobody talks about the winter entries, because there's nothing to say about them that doesn't sound like something a ranger shouldn't be saying." I mailed the log to Harper's Ferry. I don't know if anyone at the Conservancy reads the winter entries. I don't know if they've noticed the pattern. The same two words repeated across decades of winter logs from a shelter on a mountain where nobody hikes in December and January and February. Still here. Written by hands that know how to form letters but find forming difficult. Signed with names that belong to the dead. I went back to the shelter the following fall to collect the summer log and prepare the site for winter. The shelter was in good condition. The roof was intact. The sleeping platform was clean. The plastic box was mounted on the post. Inside the box was the summer log, full of the usual entries from through hikers and section hikers, trail names and weather reports, and the smiley faces and complaints and gratitude that make up the living record of the Appalachian Trail. Beneath the summer log, in the same plastic box, was a second notebook. I hadn't placed it there. Nobody on my team had placed it there. It was a waterproof notebook identical to the ones the Conservancy provides, new, with a green cover and unlined pages. I opened it. The first page had a single entry, dated October 15th, the day before I arrived, a name I didn't recognize, a mountain surname, an old-fashioned first name, and the note, "Still here." The rest of the notebook was blank, waiting, ready for 91 more entries, by 91 more people who don't exist in any record but who have been signing their names in a visitor log on a mountain where they lived and died and apparently never left. Still here, on the ridge where the wind blows and the snow falls, and the shelter sits empty through the winter, and the notebook fills with names. Still here, where they've always been, where they'll always be, on a mountain that remembers them even if the records don't, in a shelter that holds their names even if the world has forgotten their faces. Writing in careful, effortful script with the deliberate hand of the barely literate, the patient, persistent declaration of people who want you to know that they haven't gone, that the mountain didn't take them, that they're still on the ridge where they've been for 150 years, signing their names in the only record that accepts them, leaving the only message they have left to leave. Still here, still here, still here. The tower is on a ridge in the George Washington National Forest, about 15 miles west of Staunton, Virginia, at an elevation of 3,400 feet. It was built in 1942 by the Civilian Conservation Corps, a 14 by 14-foot cab on a 60-foot steel frame, the standard design that the Forest Service deployed across the eastern mountains during the fire protection era, when human eyes on high ground were the primary defense against wildfire. Most of the towers in the George Washington have been decommissioned. This one survived because the ridge it sits on provides a line of sight across the Shenandoah Valley that satellite monitoring and aircraft reconnaissance haven't fully replaced. The tower is staffed seasonally. One ranger, April through October, living in the cab 7 days a week with a radio, a pair of Osborne Firefinder binoculars, a propane stove, a cot, and the particular brand of solitude that comes from being the only person on a mountaintop for months at a time. I took the position in April of 2022. I was 29, 3 years into my career with the Forest Service, and I'd spent the previous 2 seasons doing trail maintenance in the Jefferson National Forest, which is physically demanding work that I enjoyed but that operates in teams, and I wanted a season of something different. The tower posting appealed to me because I've always been comfortable with being alone. I grew up on a farm in Augusta County, where the nearest neighbor was a mile away. Eye and silence was the default condition of daily life, and the idea of spending 6 months on a mountaintop with nothing but a radio, a logbook, and the horizon felt like a return to something familiar, rather than a departure into something difficult. My supervisor, a district ranger named Harmon who'd been running fire operations in the George Washington for 20 years, was straightforward about the posting. He said the tower was isolated. No cell signal, no internet, no running water. You hauled it in jugs from the spring at the base of the ridge. The nearest road was 2 miles down, a fire road that was passable in dry weather and impassable in wet. Resupply was weekly, weather permitting. The previous ranger who'd held the position had quit mid-season in August of the previous year without giving a reason. The one before her had lasted 3 weeks. Harmon said some people couldn't handle the quiet. He said it without emphasis, the way you'd say some people can't handle spicy food, as a statement of individual variation rather than a judgment. The first 4 days were exactly what I'd expected. I hiked in on a Monday with my gear and my supplies, and I climbed the 60 feet of steel stairs to the cab, and I settled into the routine that fire lookouts have followed for 80 years. Scan the horizon at regular intervals, log the weather, monitor the radio, cook meals on the propane stove, read, write, watch the sun move across the Shenandoah Valley in an arc that paints the landscape in a progression of light that starts gold in the morning and ends amber in the evening, and is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen from the same chair, day after day. The nights were dark, and the silence was complete, and the stars from 3,400 feet were dense enough that the Milky Way cast a visible shadow on the catwalk outside the cab. On the 5th morning, I woke before dawn. This wasn't unusual. The cab faces east, and as the season progressed and the days lengthened, the pre-dawn light entered the windows early enough that my body began waking with it. The gradual brightening of the sky to the east, pulling me out of sleep the way an alarm clock would have done at a lower elevation. I lay on the cot for a few minutes, the way I always did, letting my eyes adjust to the gray light, listening to the wind against the cab and the creak of the steel frame and the silence beneath both. I got up, made coffee on the propane stove, and stood at the east-facing window with the mug in my hands and looked out at the valley. The sky was lightening along the ridge to the east, the horizon shifting from black to deep blue to the pale gray that precedes sunrise by about 30 minutes. The valley below was dark, the farms and the roads and the towns invisible, just the black shape of the lowland stretching to the base of the Blue Ridge on the far side. The ridge below the tower, the spine of the mountain that descended from my elevation to the valley floor, was a dark line against the lighter sky, the tree line visible as a ragged edge where the forest met the open ground of the ridge crest. And on the ridge, at the tree line, about 200 yards below the tower, there were figures, dark shapes, standing at the edge of the trees, facing the tower. I counted them. 5. Spaced about 20 feet apart, arranged in a line that followed the curvature of the ridge crest, positioned at the exact point where the forest ended and the open ground began. They were upright, vertical, the height and proportions of a standing person. They were motionless, not the temporary stillness of a person who has paused, but the absolute fixed stillness of an object that does not move because movement is not part of what it does. I set down my coffee and picked up the binoculars. The Osborne firefinders are powerful optics designed to resolve detail at distances of several miles, and at 200 yards, they should have shown me everything. Clothing, features, equipment, the identifying details that would tell me whether I was looking at hikers or hunters or trespassers or something else. I focused on the nearest figure. The binoculars brought it close, and I saw nothing. Not nothing as in a space, nothing as in an absence of detail. The shape was there, dark and vertical and person-sized, but the binoculars could not resolve it. The outline was clear against the lighter sky. The proportions were visible, but the surface of the shape had no texture, no color, no feature. It was a silhouette with depth, a three-dimensional shadow standing at the tree line, present and visible, and completely without detail. I watched for about 15 minutes. The figures didn't move. They stood in their line on the ridge, and they faced the tower, and the sky behind them lightened from gray to pink to gold. And then the sun crested the eastern ridge, and the first direct light of the day reached the tree line, where the figures stood, and they were gone, not walking away, not retreating into the forest. Gone. In the instant that the sunlight touched the ridge, the figures ceased to exist. The tree line was empty. The ridge was bare. 5 shapes that had been standing there for at least 15 minutes, possibly longer, were absent without transition, without movement, without any process that the word disappear can adequately describe. They were there, and then the light touched them, and they were not there. I scanned the ridge with the binoculars for another 10 minutes. Nothing. The tree line was empty. The forest was undisturbed. No sound of movement in the underbrush. No snapping of branches. No disturbance of any kind. The ridge looked the way it always looked in the morning light. A spine of mountain covered in oak and hickory, with a crest of grass and rock that caught the sun and held it. I wrote it in the logbook. 5 dark shapes were observed at the tree line approximately 200 yards below the tower at 0430. Shapes stationary. No detail is resolvable through optics. Shapes disappeared at sunrise. I wrote it the way I'd write any observation. Factual, precise, without interpretation. I radioed Harmon during the morning check-in and mentioned it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, probably deer. Deer bed down at the tree line and stand up before dawn, and they can look like people from a distance. I said they were standing in a line spaced 20 feet apart. He said deer do that sometimes. I said they disappeared when the sun hit them. He said deer move fast when the light changes. He said it without conviction. The way a man says something he doesn't believe because the thing he believes is something he's not going to say on a radio frequency that other rangers monitor. The figures came back the next morning. At the same time, same position, same spacing, same absolute stillness. 5 shapes in a line at the tree line, facing the tower, present in the pre-dawn darkness and absent in the light. I watched them through the binoculars, and the binoculars showed me the same thing. Silhouettes with depth, outlines without detail, shadows standing upright on a ridge where nothing cast them. They came every morning, every single morning for the remaining 3 months of my season. I would wake before dawn, make coffee, and stand at the east-facing window and look at the ridge, and they would be there. 5 figures, same line, same spacing, same tree line, same patient, motionless, forward-facing orientation. They watched the tower the way the tower watched the valley, with a sustained, unbroken attention that didn't waver or fluctuate or pause. And when the sun came, they were gone. I reported it twice more. Both times, S. Harmon said deer. Both times the word deer came through the radio with the flat, unconvincing delivery of a man who has decided that the official explanation is deer, and the official explanation is what he's going to provide, regardless of what he believes. I stopped reporting it. The figures were not interfering with my work. They were not approaching the tower. They were not doing anything except standing at the tree line in the dark and facing the direction I was in. Whatever they were consistent and predictable, and in a way that I never would have expected, I got used to them. The way you get used to any feature of a landscape that repeats without variation. They became part of the morning. Coffee, window, figures, sunrise, gone. But getting used to something is not the same as understanding it. And on the mornings when the cloud cover was low, and the dawn came slowly, and the figures stood in the gray light for longer than usual, I would watch them through the binoculars, and I would feel something that I never felt during the daylight hours when the ridge was empty, and the tower was just a tower. I would feel observed, not watched, which implies eyes and attention, and the mechanical process of vision. Observed, which implies something deeper, a recording, an assessment, an evaluation conducted by something that doesn't need eyes to see and doesn't need proximity to know what it's looking at. The season ended in October. I hiked out with my gear, and I drove to the district office. E and I turned in my logbook and my keys, and I didn't take the tower posting the following year. Not because of the figures, because of the question. The question I couldn't answer and couldn't stop asking. What were they watching for? 5 shapes on a ridge, facing a tower, every morning before dawn, for 3 months. Patient, still, attentive, present in the dark and gone in the light. They weren't approaching. They weren't threatening. They weren't doing anything except standing and facing and waiting and watching. For what? What were they watching for? What were they waiting for? And the answer that kept forming in the back of my mind, the answer that I couldn't prove and couldn't dismiss and couldn't live with comfortably on a mountaintop by myself, was that they weren't watching for anything. They were watching me. I was the fire. I was the smoke on the horizon. I was the thing they'd been assigned to monitor from the tree line at dawn, the way I'd been assigned to monitor the valley from the tower at daylight. We were doing the same job, watching from a distance, logging what we saw, reporting to something that neither of us would ever see but that both of us served. And the only difference between us was that I left when the season ended, and they didn't. They've been on that ridge since before the tower was built. They'll be there after it falls. 5 watchers at the tree line, facing up the way I faced down, both of us looking for something that the other couldn't see. The cabin is in a hollow, about 3 miles from the nearest fire road, in a section of the Blue Ridge that the Park Service acquired in the 1930s when the federal government was consolidating land for the National Forest System. The families that had lived in these hollows for generations were bought out, or relocated, or simply left when the land beneath them changed ownership, moving down to the valley towns and the county seats, and leaving behind the structures they'd built, the cabins and the barns and the root cellars and the stone chimneys that stand alone in the forest, like monuments to a way of life that the 20th century dismantled one hollow at a time. This particular cabin was built sometime in the 1870s by a family named Suttle, and who homesteaded the hollow and farmed it for about 60 years before the land was acquired. It's a single-room log structure, maybe 16 by 20 feet, with a stone chimney on the gable end and a plank door and 2 small windows with no glass. The logs are hand-hewn, squared with a broadaxe, and notched at the corners with the half-dovetailed joint that mountain builders used throughout the southern Appalachians, a technique that locks the logs together without nails or hardware, and that, when executed well, produces a structure that can stand for centuries. The Suttle's cabin has been standing for about 150 years. The roof has been replaced twice by the Park Service, once in the 60s and once in the 90s, but the walls, the chimney, and the foundation stones are original. The cabin is listed on the National Register and maintained by the Park Service as a heritage site, one of several dozen historic structures scattered through the forest that serve as physical evidence of the way people lived in these mountains before the mountains became public land. My job includes checking on the cabin twice a year. Once in the spring, after the winter has had its way with the structure, and once in the fall, before the snow comes and the hollow becomes inaccessible until April. The checks are straightforward. I hike in, inspect the exterior for damage, check the roof for leaks, look for evidence of vandalism or unauthorized use, photograph any issues that need attention, and hike out. The cabin is secured with a padlock on a hasp that the Park Service installed on the plank door in the 80s. A standard heavy-duty lock that I carry the key to on my Ranger key ring. G, along with about 30 other keys for gates. D, storage buildings, and equipment sheds across the district. I made the fall inspection on a Thursday in late November of 2023. The weather was cold and overcast, the temperature in the low 30s at the trailhead, dropping as I gained elevation on the fire road, and then the unmarked path that descends into the hollow where the cabin sits. The hollow is narrow and deep, a crease in the mountain, where a creek runs between steep slopes of hardwood and hemlock, the kind of terrain that gets about 4 hours of direct sunlight in winter and holds cold the way a bowl holds water. The path into the hollow follows the creek, crossing it twice on stepping stones that the Suttles family placed 150 years ago and that are still there, still positioned, still performing the function they were designed for, by hands that have been dust for generations. I smelled the smoke before I saw the cabin. Wood smoke, the particular scent of hardwood burning in a fireplace, the combination of oak and hickory that produces the dense, sweet, sharp smell that anyone who has lived in the mountains recognizes the way they recognize the smell of rain. It was coming from the direction of the cabin. I stopped on the path about 100 yards out and stood still and processed what I was smelling. Nobody should be at the cabin. Nobody had a permit for the hollow. The cabin was locked, D, and the lock was the kind that required a specific key that existed on my ring and on the rings of 3 other rangers in the district, and nowhere else. I continued down the path. The cabin came into view through the trees, the familiar shape of the log walls and the stone chimney visible in the gray afternoon light. And from the chimney, a thin line of smoke was rising, gray-white, the color of well-seasoned hardwood burning at a moderate rate, rising from the stone stack in a straight vertical column that the still air of the hollow held intact for about 30 feet before it dispersed into the overcast sky. Someone had built a fire in the hearth of a locked, historic cabin in a remote hollow 3 miles from the nearest road. I approached carefully, not because I expected danger, but because the situation was anomalous, and anomalous situations in remote backcountry require caution. The door was open. The plank door that I had personally padlocked on my spring inspection was standing open, swung inward against the interior wall, showing the one-room interior of the cabin with a clarity that the small, glassless windows never provided. Through the doorway, I could see the hearth. A fire was burning, small but active, the kind of fire that someone who knows how to manage a hearth maintains for warmth rather than for cooking, a controlled, efficient burn that produces heat with minimal wood consumption. The firelight filled the cabin with a warm, orange glow that was visible even in the gray afternoon light. I stepped to the doorway and looked in. The cabin was warm, not the warmth of a recently lit fire, which takes time to penetrate log walls and stone, and the cold air of a building that has been unheated for months. This was lived-in warmth, the deep, accumulated heat of a fire that has been burning for hours, possibly days, the kind of warmth that soaks into the logs and the stones and the floor until the structure itself becomes a radiator. The air inside the cabin was warm and dry, and it smelled like wood smoke and something else, something I couldn't identify at first, a faint, organic scent that might have been food, or might have been the smell of a person who has been living in a small space without ventilation. There were things on the table. The cabin has a table, a rough-hewn plank surface on 4 legs that the Suttles family built and that the Park Service has preserved as part of the historic furnishing. On a normal inspection, the table is bare, its surface covered with the fine layer of dust that accumulates on horizontal surfaces in an unoccupied building. Today, the table held objects. A tin cup, the kind made from stamped metal, with a rolled edge, the sort of cup that was common in mountain households in the 19th century, and that you can still find in antique shops and estate sales throughout the region. The cup was upright and appeared to contain liquid, though I couldn't tell what from the doorway. Beside the cup was a plate, tin as well, and on the plate were crumbs, not the crumbs of modern food, not the recognizable fragments of crackers or chips or bread from a plastic bag. The crumbs looked like cornbread, the coarse, golden brown fragments that cornbread produces when it's broken by hand have been the staple food of mountain people for 2 centuries. Beside the plate was a folding knife with a bone handle, the blade closed, the handle worn smooth with use, the patina of an object that has been carried in a pocket and held in a hand and used for the daily cutting tasks that mountain life requires. The objects looked period appropriate, not antique in the decorative sense, not the carefully preserved artifacts that collectors seek. Period appropriate in the functional sense, objects that were being used for their intended purpose by someone who considered them everyday tools rather than historical curiosities. The tin cup and the tin plate and the bone-handled knife belonged to the cabin the way the hearth and the table and the log walls belonged to it, as components of a domestic space that had been active and inhabited and warm. I looked at the door. The padlock was on the ground beside the threshold, lying on the dirt where it had apparently fallen or been placed. I picked it up. It was locked. The shackle was closed, the keyhole aligned, the lock in its secured position. The hasp on the door frame was intact, the screws still seated in the wood, the metal plate undamaged. The padlock had not been cut, forced, or picked. It was simply not on the hasp. The door was open, and the lock was locked. D and the 2 facts coexisted without resolution. The lock had been removed from the hasp while remaining in its locked state, which is not physically possible, or the lock had been locked after removal, which would require the key that was on my ring, and that had been on my ring since the spring inspection. I stepped inside. The warmth enclosed me, the fire crackled. The room smelled like smoke and cornbread, and the faint, unidentifiable scent that I now recognized as habitation, the smell of a person living in a space, the accumulation of breath and body heat, and the organic traces that a human presence deposits in an enclosed environment over time. Someone had been living in this cabin, not camping in it, not sheltering for a night, living in it. The warmth and the smell and the objects on the table spoke of sustained occupation, days at least, possibly longer. A person or persons who had built a fire and maintained it and cooked food and eaten it and sat at the table and used the knife and drunk from the cup and slept, presumably, on the floor near the hearth where the warmth was greatest. I photographed everything: the fire, the table, the cup, the plate, and the knife, the padlock on the ground, the open door, the smoke rising from the chimney. I took wide-angle shots and detail shots, and I documented the scene with the thoroughness of someone who knows that what he's seeing will be difficult to explain and wants the record to be complete. I hiked out, 3 miles back up the hollow and along the fire road to the trailhead where my truck was parked. I drove to the district office and filed my report and uploaded the photographs and described the scene to my supervisor, the same Caldwell who had supervised my previous anomalous encounters in the forest, the man who had told me about the stairs and the campsites, and who received each new report with the steady, unsurprised demeanor of someone who has been collecting these stories for decades and has long since stopped expecting them to have explanations. A team went back to the cabin 2 days later. 2 rangers and a maintenance specialist, equipped with tools and materials to secure the site and address whatever security failure had allowed unauthorized access. They hiked in on a Saturday morning and reached the cabin around 10. The cabin was cold. The hearth was clean. Not a single ash. Not a single fragment of charcoal. The stone firebox was swept bare, the surface showing the smooth, soot-darkened stone that it always showed on routine inspections. The table was empty. No cup, no plate, no knife, no crumbs. The surface was covered with the fine, even layer of dust that accumulates on a table in an unoccupied building, undisturbed, without a fingerprint or a ring mark, or any indication that an object had sat on it recently. The air inside the cabin was cold, mountain cold, the deep, still cold of a log structure that has not been heated in months. The padlock was on the door, on the hasp, engaged, locked. The same padlock that I had found on the ground 2 days earlier, locked and detached, was now in its correct position, securing the door in the closed position, as if it had never been removed. The ranger who led the team unlocked it with his key, the key that matched mine, and they entered and found nothing. No evidence of the fire, no evidence of the food, no evidence that anyone had been inside the cabin since my spring inspection 6 months earlier. My photographs are in the database. The fire, the cup, the plate, the knife, the smoke from the chimney, the padlock on the ground. Evidence of an occupation that, 2 days later, had erased itself, leaving the cabin cold and locked and empty and covered in dust, the way it has been for the 90 years since the Suttles family left the hollow and the Park Service took the land. I think about the Suttles family. I think about the people who built that cabin with a broadaxe and a determination that the mountain required, and who lived in it for 60 years, cooking on that hearth and eating at that table and using a knife with a bone handle to cut their cornbread and their meat and whatever else the hollow provided. I think about what it means to live in a place for 60 years and then leave it, to walk out of a hollow where 3 generations of your family were born and raised and buried, and to know that the building you built will stand in the forest without you, maintained by strangers for reasons that have nothing to do with the life you lived in it. And I think about the fire in the hearth, the warmth that wasn't recent but accumulated, the smell of habitation, the cup with liquid in it and the plate with crumbs. The knife, warm from a pocket, was set down beside the plate the way a man sets down his knife when he's finished eating and is resting before he cleans up. Someone was in that cabin, someone who cooked cornbread and built a fire and sat at the table and used the same kind of implements that the Suttles family used 150 years ago. Someone who entered through a locked door without breaking the lock, and who left before a team arrived, and who took everything with them, including the fire, including the warmth, including every trace of their presence except the photographs on my camera that prove they were there. And I wonder if they left, or if they were always there, if the Suttles family never really left the hollow, if the thing that connects a family to the land they've worked for 60 years is strong enough to outlast the family itself, a bond that doesn't require living people to maintain it, that keeps the fire burning and the table set and the cabin warm in a hollow where nobody has lived, Since the Park Service came, and the homesteaders went, and the forest grew back over the fields they'd cleared. And I wonder if the cabin is always like that, warm and occupied and lived in, and the cold, dusty, empty version that we see on our inspections is the anomaly. And the padlock on the door isn't keeping people out, it's keeping us from seeing what's inside. And the Suttles are still there, have always been there, cooking and eating and sitting by the fire in a cabin that belongs to them in a way that no deed or acquisition or federal designation can override. Still in the hollow, still at the table, still home.